72 million years ago, while dinosaurs ruled the land, something else ruled the sea. Not a mosasaur, not a shark, not any creature with a spine, something with arms. We've spent centuries imagining the kraken as a myth, a monster too large and too strange to be real. But in April of this year, a study published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world quietly suggested that the kraken may have been real and that it may have been the most powerful predator in the entire ocean. The evidence for its existence? It fits in the palm of your hand, a single fossilized jaw, no bigger than something you might find washed up on a beach, became the key to reconstructing a creature that may have stretched the length of a city bus, maybe longer, something so far outside what we thought we knew about prehistoric life that scientists are still trying to understand what it means. Its name is Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, and almost nothing of it survived. No arms, no skin, no body, just the beak, just the mouth. But what that mouth reveals is where this story gets genuinely strange. Tonight, we descend into the warm, dark oceans of the Late Cretaceous, a world teeming with monsters, to ask a question that scientists are only now beginning to answer. What was this thing? How big did it actually get? And what does its existence mean for everything we thought we knew about who was in charge of the ancient sea? Get comfortable. If you enjoy slow, fascinating deep dives like this one, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. And if you feel comfortable sharing, let me know in the comments. What part of the world are you watching from, and what is the time over there? I love seeing how far across the world these stories travel. Now let's begin. Long before the beaks settled into stone beneath Vancouver Island, the ocean itself had become something broader, warmer, and almost unrecognizable beside the world that exists now. Between roughly 86 and 72 million years ago, during the Santonian and Campanian stages of the Late Cretaceous, shorelines sat far inland from their modern positions. Water occupied immense stretches of continental lowland. Vast inland seas cut through continents that today appear solid and continuous. The planet carried almost no permanent ice. Even the poles remained free of frozen caps, their coastlines bordered not by glaciers, but by forests and dark marine water, moving slowly beneath pale seasonal light. The North Pacific of this age spread outward as a single connected basin between what would one day become Japan and the western margin of North America. Hokkaido and Vancouver Island, now separated by thousands of kilometers of open ocean, rested within the same marine system, linked through uninterrupted warm water, carrying drifting plankton, migrating predators, and storms that crossed entire hemispheres. Ocean circulation moved differently across the Cretaceous Earth. Heat accumulated easily and remained trapped for long intervals beneath greenhouse skies rich in carbon dioxide. In some shallow seas, temperatures climbed above 44 degrees Celsius, approaching conditions that would seem almost impossible in the modern ocean. The water column itself held layers of stillness beneath its surface activity. Far below the brighter upper sea, the basin floors remained quiet and slow. Fine sediment descended continuously through the darkness, grain after grain, forming soft blankets across the seafloor over immense spans of time. Oxygen levels occasionally collapsed in these deeper zones, creating stretches of anoxic water where scavengers could not thrive, and bacterial decay weakened. Dead animals sinking from above sometimes reached the bottom intact enough for burial to begin before the ocean could fully reclaim them. The future fossils of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti entered this silence one descent at a time, settling into mud that would harden over millions of years into the rocks of the Nanaimo group. Around those descending remains moved one of the densest marine ecosystems Earth has ever produced. Mosasaurs crossed the open water with long muscular bodies and powerful crescent tails, some reaching nearly 18 meters in length. Their jaws carried rows of curved teeth, suited for gripping fish, marine reptiles, and shelled cephalopods. Plesiosaurs drifted through deeper layers with elongated necks that unfolded through the water like pale living cables, their four flippers rowing steadily beneath broad torsos. Sharks moved between them. Cretoxyrhina, later nicknamed the Ginsu shark, cut through warm currents with narrow conical teeth built for slicing flesh from struggling prey. Elsewhere in the basin, giant bony fish swallowed smaller animals whole. Xiphectinus, reaching approximately 5 meters long, carried a mouth large enough for prey nearly half its own size. Fossils discovered elsewhere in the Cretaceous world would later preserve entire fish still inside its stomach cavity, frozen in the final moments before digestion began. Ammonites drifted through these waters in coiled shells, patterned with delicate ridges and chambers, rising and sinking through changing pressure with controlled buoyancy. Belemnites gathered in enormous numbers, their torpedo-shaped bodies flashing beneath the surface before vanishing again into deeper water. All of it existed together beneath a climate unlike the modern Earth, within an ocean stretched across drowned coastlines and submerged continental shelves. The sea carried warmth almost everywhere. Storm systems crossed wider waters. Sediment accumulated slowly beneath the darkness below. And somewhere within that immense Pacific basin, among reptiles, sharks, ammonites, and fish, moved the lineage that would eventually leave behind only a handful of fossilized jaws and the faint outline of something the ocean nearly erased completely. The first clues rested unnoticed inside ordinary pieces of stone, carried home in backpacks and plastic field buckets by people walking the shorelines of Vancouver Island with patient eyes and quiet habits. Along the eastern coast of the island, dark sedimentary cliffs of the Nanaimo group rose above beaches layered with broken shale and fragments weathered loose by rain and tide. Amateur fossil collectors had searched these outcrops for decades, moving slowly across the exposed rock surfaces, turning over pieces of ancient seabed that had once rested beneath the warm Pacific waters of the Late Cretaceous. The Nanaimo group itself stretched across a broad section of Vancouver Island as a sequence of marine sedimentary formations deposited between roughly 90 and 70 million years ago. Its layers recorded the slow accumulation of mud, silt, volcanic debris, and biological remains along a long-vanished basin margin. The rocks carried the name of Nanaimo, the coastal city near many of the best-known exposures, though the sediments extended far beyond the modern town into forests, shorelines, and low coastal ridges shaped millions of years after the ancient sea disappeared. Within this sequence lay the Pender Formation, a quieter and finer-grained unit where marine fossils occasionally emerged from the stone with remarkable preservation. Ammonites appeared there in compressed spirals. Fragments of fish bone surfaced among the shale. Pieces of shell and traces of distant marine ecosystems remained locked inside layers of dark sediment, hardened over geological time. Somewhere among those fragments, collectors began finding unusual structures, unlike the surrounding fossils, curved dark forms embedded inside the rock, small enough to fit easily in the palm of a hand. At first, they did not fully understand what they were holding. The fossils resembled jaws, though not the jaws of fish or reptiles familiar from other Cretaceous discoveries. They possessed sharp curves and compact shapes, more similar to the beaks of living cephalopods. The specimens were collected carefully, and eventually transferred to the Courtenay and District Museum and Paleontological Center in Courtenay, British Columbia, where they joined shelves of catalogued fossils gathered from across the island. There they remained for years, preserved, labeled, occasionally examined, yet still only partially understood within the larger history of the ocean that produced them. During this period, Canadian paleontologist Jim Haggart worked extensively on the geology and fossil record of the region through the Geological Survey of Canada. His research helped establish the age, environmental history, and paleontological significance of the Nanaimo group formations. The sediments of Vancouver Island became clearer through his work, their chronology refined layer by layer across the fading remains of the Cretaceous Pacific margin. When researchers later identified the larger octopus species from these fossil jaws, they honored that contribution by naming the animal Nanaimoteuthis haggarti. The story widened further across the Pacific. Similar fossil jaws emerged from another ancient marine deposit, far from British Columbia, the Yezo group of Hokkaido, Japan. During the Late Cretaceous, these distant coastlines belonged to the same broad oceanic system, and the sediments of both regions preserved traces of similar marine life drifting through connected waters beneath the greenhouse skies of the era. As specimens from both regions accumulated, researchers eventually identified 27 fossilized beaks belonging to the Nanaimoteuthis lineage. 15 were already known from earlier collections and publications, visible within prepared rock samples and museum holdings. The remaining 12 stayed hidden inside unbroken stone, invisible from the surface and unreachable through conventional examination. For years they remained sealed within the rock itself, suspended in darkness since the late Cretaceous, waiting inside the sediment until a different kind of paleontology learned how to see through stone without breaking it apart. Most creatures vanish completely after death. In the ocean, disappearance begins almost immediately, carried out not by catastrophe, but by ordinary biological work. Scavengers arrive first. Bacteria spread through tissue. Currents pull soft material apart strand by strand until the shape of the animal loosens and dissolves into the surrounding water. For octopuses, this process happens with particular speed. Their bodies contain almost nothing rigid enough to resist it. No bones remain after the flesh is gone. No shells hold the outline together. Muscle collapses inward, skin tears apart, and the long architecture of the arms disappears into drifting organic fragments within days or weeks beneath normal marine conditions. This is why the fossil record of octopuses feels less like a history and more like scattered interruptions and silence. Marine reptiles left vertebrae, skulls, and teeth. Fish left spines and scales. Ammonites carried coiled shells thick enough to survive pressure, burial, and geological time. Octopuses left almost nothing at all. Across hundreds of millions of years of ocean history, entire lineages moved through ancient seas without preserving more than occasional traces of their existence. Their intelligence, their hunting behavior, their movements through the water, all of it passed almost invisibly through the fossil record. One structure alone resisted complete erasure. Buried at the center of the animal, where the arms converged beneath the mantle, sat the beak, compact, dark, and sharply curved. It resembled the bill of a parrot more than the jaw of any fish or reptile. The upper portion folded downward over the lower half in a tight cutting arrangement built for shearing, crushing, and tearing prey apart. In living octopuses, the beak is the final tool in the feeding process, hidden beneath layers of muscle and surrounded by flexible tissue that guides captured prey inward from the arms toward the mouth. Its durability comes from chitin, a resilient biological material also found in crab shells, insect exoskeletons, and the hard outer coverings of countless arthropods. Chitin does not fossilize easily in every environment, but it survives far longer than exposed muscle or skin. Under the right conditions, especially in places where oxygen remains low and bacterial decay slows, a beak can persist long enough for sediment to cover it and begin the slow transition from organic structure into fossil. The ancient basin sediments of the Nanaimo group provided exactly that kind of environment. Deep below the warmer upper ocean layers, the seafloor periodically slipped into oxygen-depleted conditions where decomposition weakened and disturbance became minimal. Fine sediment settled quietly across the bottom, covering remains gently rather than scattering them. Most of the octopus still disappeared. Arms dissolved, mantle tissue collapsed, fins and webbing vanished without preserving their form. Yet the beak sometimes remained intact long enough for burial to continue around it, sealing the structure inside accumulating sediment that would eventually harden into stone. Everything now associated with Nanaimoteuthis emerges from those surviving jaws alone. Its estimated size comes from the proportions of the beak. Its possible diet comes from scratches and wear along the cutting surfaces. Interpretations of behavior, feeding mechanics, and even lateralized habits all begin with those preserved curves of chitin resting inside the rock. There are no preserved eyes, no impressions of skin, no complete body fossils stretched across the shale like the skeletons of marine reptiles elsewhere in the Cretaceous record. The animal itself remains absent, reduced to the single structure most capable of enduring after the rest of the body returned to the ocean. The beak became a narrow opening through which an entire lost organism could be partially seen again, not directly, but through proportion, damage, texture, and shape. In the silence left by soft tissue decomposition, those small fossil jaws carried nearly everything the ancient sea allowed to survive. Inside museum storage rooms, countless fossils remain hidden in plain sight. Shelves hold blocks of stone wrapped in labels and catalog numbers, collected from cliffs, quarries, and remote field sites across decades of paleontological work. Many were examined only at the surface before being stored away again, their interiors left untouched because the risk of damaging what might lie inside outweighed the uncertainty of what could be found. Among the rock samples connected to Nanaimoteuthis, several carried exactly this uncertainty: small Cretaceous stones containing shapes no one could yet see. Traditional fossil preparation depends on physical removal. Paleontologists chip away matrix grain by grain using needles, drills, brushes, and fine pneumatic tools, exposing buried structures slowly from the surrounding rock. For larger skeletons with dense bone, the method can work remarkably well, but cephalopod jaws presented a different problem. The fossilized beaks were compact, delicate, and partially merged with sediment that hardened around them over tens of millions of years, their boundaries blurred into the stone itself. Attempting to expose them mechanically risked grinding away the very structures researchers hoped to preserve. Some specimens remained completely sealed, their contents invisible from the exterior. The stone showed no obvious outline, no crack or ridge hinting at the fossil hidden within. For years, those samples rested in collections as unopened geological records, carrying traces of ancient animals inaccessible through ordinary preparation. At Hokkaido University, researchers approached the problem from a different direction. Instead of removing fossils from rock, they began reconstructing the inside of the rock itself. The technique became known as digital fossil mining, a process that transformed physical stone into layered image data through extreme precision and patience. Rock samples were ground away in microscopic increments, each newly exposed surface photographed at very high resolution before the next layer was removed. Thousands of these images accumulated one after another, forming a sequence of internal cross-sections through the sample. As the slices progressed deeper into the stone, the images could be digitally stacked into complete three-dimensional maps of the specimen interior. Hidden structures emerged gradually within the datasets, not as exposed physical fossils, but as differences in texture, color, and density embedded inside the virtual reconstruction of the rock. The process resembled excavation without direct contact, revealing buried forms while leaving the original fossil matrix essentially undisturbed in physical space. The scale of information quickly exceeded what human observers could easily process alone. Thousands upon thousands of cross-sectional images contained subtle patterns almost impossible to track consistently by eye. To search these datasets, the team introduced a zero-shot learning artificial intelligence model, a system designed to identify structures it had never been specifically trained to recognize beforehand. Rather than memorizing a single fossil shape, the model learned broader visual relationships and structural patterns, allowing it to detect possible cephalopod jaw morphology, even when preservation remained incomplete or partially obscured by surrounding sediment. The artificial intelligence scanned through the image layers and began marking locations where curved internal structures resembled fossilized beaks. Some remained faint and fragmented. Others had partially merged with the rock during fossilization, their boundaries softened by mineral replacement across geological time. Yet the system repeatedly identified shapes matching the expected morphology of Nanaimoteuthis jaws, hidden entirely within the stone. From this process emerged 12 additional fossil beaks that had never previously been observed. Researchers reconstructed them digitally as detailed three-dimensional models without cutting directly into the fossils themselves. Structures buried since the Late Cretaceous appeared again, not first as physical objects held in the hand, but as virtual forms assembled from layered data deep inside ancient rock. The implications extended quietly beyond this single species. Museum collections across the world contain enormous quantities of unprepared stone gathered through more than a century of fossil collecting. Many may hold hidden specimens too delicate for conventional excavation. Digital fossil mining now offers another path into those archives, allowing paleontology to search through sealed rock without breaking it apart, revealing organisms that have remained concealed inside museum shelves for generations. Not all of the fossil jaws carried the same proportions. As researchers compared the recovered specimens side by side, subtle differences began separating the collection into distinct forms. Some jaws curved more narrowly. Others possessed heavier structures and deeper hood regions near the front of the beak. Their sizes diverged as well, not gradually across a smooth spectrum, but in patterns suggesting two separate animals moving through different spans of Cretaceous time within the same lineage. The smaller and older species became known as Nanaimoteuthis gillespie. It was formally described in 2008 by Kazushige Tanabe and colleagues during earlier work on fossil cephalopod jaws from the Pacific region. Fossils assigned to this species appeared across a broad stretch of geological history, extending from approximately 100 million years ago until roughly 72 million years ago, surviving through nearly 28 million years of changing marine ecosystems. Its lower jaw hood length measured approximately 39.6 millimeters. From that relatively modest structure, researchers estimated a total body length ranging between roughly 2.8 and 7.7 meters, depending on proportional assumptions drawn from living cephalopods. Even the lower end of that estimate described a large octopus by modern standards. At the upper end, Nanaimoteuthis gillespie likely rivaled or exceeded the dimensions of the largest giant Pacific octopuses alive today. Animals already capable of stretching their arms across several meters of water while remaining almost entirely soft-bodied. For much of its existence, that scale alone would have made the species remarkable within the history of octopus evolution. Yet, among the fossil collections from Vancouver Island and Hokkaido, another set of jaws began to emerge that did not belong within the same proportions at all. These larger fossils were eventually recognized as a second species, Nanaimoteuthis haggarti. The animal appeared in the fossil record approximately 86 million years ago, long after the earlier species had already persisted across millions of years of Cretaceous seas. Its lower jaw hood length reached approximately 86.4 millimeters, more than twice the measurement recorded in Nanaimoteuthis Geological. Even separated from the body that once surrounded it, the scale of the structure altered the entire interpretation of the lineage. Nanaimoteuthis haggarti remained present in the fossil record until roughly 72 million years ago, surviving for approximately 14 million years before vanishing from known sediments. During that interval, the North Pacific still carried giant marine reptiles, enormous fish, and dense populations of shelled cephalopods through warm connected seas. Yet alongside those familiar Cretaceous animals moved an octopus lineage undergoing a dramatic increase in size, unlike anything previously associated with finned octopuses. The evolutionary pattern became difficult to ignore. Earlier members of the lineage were already large, capable predators, occupying substantial ecological space within the marine environment. But over time, the proportions escalated. Jaw dimensions expanded. Estimated body lengths widened far beyond the scale seen in living relatives. The progression suggested more than isolated gigantism within a single individual. It pointed toward a lineage gradually moving into a different biological category altogether. By the time Nanaimoteuthis haggarti appeared, these octopuses had crossed into dimensions comparable with the dominant marine vertebrates of the era. The transition carried quiet implications about the ecological conditions of the Late Cretaceous Pacific, where warmth, prey abundance, and expansive ocean basins may have supported increasing body size across multiple predator lineages simultaneously. In cephalopods, gigantism had emerged before among shelled ancestors drifting through much older seas. But this was different. These animals carried no external shell, no rigid skeletal support, almost no preservable anatomy beyond the jaws themselves. And still, through millions of years of evolution within the Cretaceous Ocean, the lineage expanded toward extraordinary scale. Nanaimoteuthis geological remained an impressive predator shaped by ancient Pacific waters. Nanaimoteuthis haggarti stepped beyond that threshold into something far less familiar, an octopus lineage approaching dimensions that blurred the boundary between exceptional and almost unimaginable within the history of soft-bodied life. For many years, the fossil jaws seemed to belong to a different branch of cephalopod life entirely. When Nanaimoteuthis geological was first described in 2008, researchers placed the species within Vampiromorphidae, the small and unusual cephalopod order containing the modern vampire squid. At the time, the classification appeared reasonable. The fossil material remained limited, the anatomy incomplete, and deep-sea cephalopod evolution still carried large gaps across its fossil record. The vampire squid itself occupies a strange position within the modern ocean. Despite its name, it is not truly a squid in the ordinary sense. Nor is it an octopus exactly like the shallow water species more familiar to human observation. Vampiroteuthis infernalis survives today as the lone living representative of an ancient lineage, drifting through oxygen minimum zones far below the surface, where many other predators struggle to survive. Its dark-webbed arms, soft, gelatinous body, and slow movements through dim water give it an appearance almost detached from the modern marine world, as though it belongs to a deeper and older chapter of ocean history. The original fossil jaws carried certain broad similarities that encouraged comparison with this lineage. Their proportions suggested a soft-bodied cephalopod, adapted for deeper marine environments, and without preserved arms, fins, or body tissue. The classification depended heavily on subtle details within the beaks themselves. For nearly 2 decades, the fossils remained situated within that interpretation. The reassessment arrived only after the larger study assembled more specimens and applied closer comparative analysis to the jaw morphology. As researchers from Hokkaido University examined the expanded fossil collection, the structure of the beaks began aligning less convincingly with vampire squids and more strongly with another cephalopod order altogether, Cerata, the finned octopuses. The distinction carried enormous evolutionary consequences hidden beneath what seemed at first like a technical correction. Cerate octopuses form a separate and highly specialized branch of octopus evolution, recognizable by delicate hair-like cirri lining their arms and paired fins projecting from the mantle. Most living species inhabit the deep ocean, often thousands of meters below the surface, in regions rarely visited, even by research submersibles. They drift slowly through cold water with soft umbrella-like webs stretched between their arms, feeding on small invertebrates and moving with a calm, buoyant motion, unlike the rapid jet propulsion associated with squids. Compared to more familiar octopus species, cirrids remain poorly understood. Many have been observed only briefly through remotely operated vehicles crossing the abyss. Some are known from just a handful of collected specimens. Their habitats lie within some of the least accessible environments on Earth, where darkness, pressure, and distance isolate them almost completely from sustained human observation. Yet the fossil jaws from the Cretaceous Pacific aligned most closely with this elusive lineage. The reclassification shifted the known history of Cerata backward by approximately 15 million years. Suddenly, finned octopuses were no longer recent, deep-sea specialists emerging late in cephalopod evolution. Their lineage now extended at least 100 million years into the past, deep into the late Cretaceous oceans. The broader fossil history of octopuses themselves moved backward as well, extending approximately 5 million years earlier than previously recognized. More quietly, the reinterpretation transformed assumptions about what cerate octopuses were capable of becoming. Modern members of the group are generally small, delicate, and rarely exceed modest body lengths. Nothing in the living ocean hints at a lineage once capable of producing animals on the scale reconstructed for Nanaimoteuthis haggarti. The modern deep-sea forms seem diminished beside the fossil evidence emerging from the Pacific sediments. The beaks revealed a different history concealed beneath the present ocean. Long before the surviving cerates retreated into darkness and small body sizes, their lineage occupied a warmer world filled with giant marine predators and enormous cephalopods. Within that ancient ocean, finned octopuses were not marginal deep-sea drifters, isolated in inaccessible depths. They had already expanded into forms approaching extraordinary scale, carrying their soft, boneless bodies through Cretaceous waters vast enough to support them. A single measurement sits beneath nearly every discussion of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, small enough to fit easily on a ruler, yet large enough to reshape the scale of an extinct animal. The largest lower jaw fossil recovered from the species carries a hood length of approximately 86.4 millimeters. In ordinary terms, the structure is still compact, shorter than the width of an adult hand. Yet among cephalopods, where soft bodies leave little else behind, that curved section of fossilized beak became the central reference point from which the entire animal had to be reconstructed. Modern cephalopod biology offers the only framework available for interpreting such a fragment. In living species, the size of the beak maintains proportional relationships with the dimensions of the head, the mantle, and the total length of the body. The ratios vary across lineages, but they remain biologically consistent enough to allow cautious estimation when only jaws survive. Researchers studying Nanaimoteuthis compared the fossil measurements primarily with living finned octopuses, especially modern serrate species, whose anatomy most closely resembles the reconstructed lineage. One comparison immediately stood apart: the lower jaw of the modern giant squid, Architeuthis ducks, currently regarded as the largest living invertebrate, measures substantially smaller than the largest Nanaimoteuthis specimen. The fossil jaw reached approximately 1.5 times the size of a giant squid beak. This did not automatically prove a larger overall body, since proportions differ between squids and octopuses, but the comparison established a critical sense of scale. The fossil did not belong to a modest deep-sea animal. Even isolated from the rest of the body, the jaw alone exceeded structures associated with some of the largest invertebrates alive today. To move beyond direct comparison, the Hokkaido research team applied established proportional models derived from living serrate octopuses. Particular attention focused on the Dumbo octopus, one of the closest modern analogs available within the same broad lineage. Measurements connecting jaw dimensions to body length in living specimens allowed researchers to extrapolate a possible size range for Nanaimoteuthis haggarti. The result was not a precise number, but a spectrum of possibilities. At the conservative end, the animal measured approximately 6.6 meters in total length. At the upper end, the estimate expanded dramatically to roughly 18.6 meters. Between those boundaries lay a wide field of uncertainty shaped by the limitations of cephalopod anatomy itself. Unlike vertebrates, octopuses possess highly flexible bodies with proportions that can vary considerably across species. Arm length differs, mantle dimensions shift. Deep-sea serrate octopuses remain difficult to study because they inhabit remote environments rarely accessible to sustained observation. Many known specimens arrive damaged from collection, their soft tissue distorted by pressure changes during ascent from the abyss. Precise scaling relationships remain incomplete even among living representatives of the group. Because of this, the fossil measurements cannot produce a perfectly fixed reconstruction. The estimates instead describe a biologically plausible range grounded in available comparative anatomy. Yet even the lowest end of that range places Nanaimoteuthis haggarti among unusually large octopuses. A 6.6 meter serrate would already represent a substantial predator within both ancient and modern marine ecosystems, carrying immense arms and a body unlike anything presently observed among living finned octopuses. At the upper estimate, however, the proportions move into unfamiliar territory altogether. 18.6 meters approaches the dimensions of the largest marine reptiles inhabiting the same Late Cretaceous ocean. At that scale, the image of a finned octopus changes fundamentally. The body ceases to resemble the small drifting serrates of the modern abyss, and instead becomes something expansive enough to share ecological space with giant vertebrate predators. All of that emerged from a structure smaller than a human hand. a preserved curve of chitin resting inside Cretaceous stone. The body vanished long ago into the chemistry of the ocean, but the proportions remained hidden inside the jaw, waiting for comparison, mathematics, and anatomy to pull the outline of the animal slowly back into view. Numbers alone rarely communicate the true physical presence of an animal. 18.6 meters exists comfortably on paper, compact enough to fit inside a line of scientific text beside measurements and taxonomic labels. The mind accepts it abstractly at first, detached from motion, mass, or environment. Only when translated into familiar scale does the estimate begin to unfold into something tangible within physical space. An articulated city bus extends to roughly the same length. A bowling lane stretches across a similar distance from foul line to pins. In open water, an octopus occupying that span would not appear merely large. Its body would fill a substantial volume of the surrounding sea, arms extending outward through the water column across distances usually associated with marine reptiles rather than soft-bodied invertebrates. For generations, the giant squid represented the accepted upper boundary of invertebrate size. Architeuthis, ducks, elusive and rarely observed alive, reached estimated lengths of approximately 12 to 13 meters, including its elongated feeding tentacles. Even in modern oceans, encounters with giant squid remain uncommon enough that the animal carries an atmosphere of distance and uncertainty around it. Yet the upper estimate proposed for Nanaimoteuthis haggarti exceeds that length by nearly 6 additional meters. The difference matters because large marine animals do not scale gently. Each added meter represents substantial increases in tissue, arm reach, muscular demand, and ecological presence. A creature approaching 19 meters enters dimensions occupied by some of the dominant vertebrate predators of the late Cretaceous ocean. The largest mosasaurs, long regarded as among the supreme marine hunters of their time, measured within roughly the same range, approximately 17 to 18 meters in length, depending on species and specimen. At that scale, the familiar categories separating marine reptiles from soft-bodied cephalopods begin to blur. Nanaimoteuthis haggarti no longer resembles the image most people associate with octopuses. The comparison shifts instead toward the broader architecture of apex marine life itself, animals large enough to influence ecosystems simply through their presence and feeding behavior. Researchers reacting to the study often returned first to the sheer dimensions implied by the fossil jaws. Cameron Sujita, a paleontology professor at Western University, described the animal as terrifyingly large, while also acknowledging the uncertainty surrounding the broader estimates. The phrase carried less sensationalism than simple proportional recognition. Even allowing for substantial variation in body scaling, the reconstructed animal remained unusually immense by any known octopus standard. Paleobiologist Thomas Clements of the University of Reading, who was not directly involved in the research, responded to the fossil beak itself with similar astonishment. "To see a beak this size is quite amazing, to be honest," he remarked. "It was a massive animal. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to go swimming in the ancient oceans if these things were swimming around." His reaction reflected the peculiar psychological effect produced by cephalopod gigantism. Marine reptiles possess skeletons that anchor them comfortably within prehistoric imagination. Giant octopuses feel different, perhaps because their bodies remain almost entirely muscle and nervous tissue, fluid shapes capable of folding, stretching, and moving with unfamiliar flexibility despite immense scale. Yasuhiro Iba, senior author of the study, approached the implications more directly. Based on the reconstructed dimensions, he stated that Nanaimoteuthis haggarti represents one of the largest invertebrates ever identified and may even have been the largest animal inhabiting the North Pacific seas of the Late Cretaceous. The statement quietly rearranged the hierarchy traditionally imagined for those ecosystems. The largest predator in that ancient basin may not have carried vertebrae, armored skin, or bone at all. And still, the estimate begins with a fossil jaw scarcely larger than a hand. The entire reconstruction of scale unfolds outward from that preserved fragment through anatomy, comparison, and proportion. From one curved structure buried in Cretaceous sediment emerged the possibility of an octopus occupying the same physical dimensions as the great marine reptiles of its age, drifting through warm Pacific waters on a body plan built almost entirely from softness and motion. No complete body of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti has ever been found. The ocean removed nearly all direct evidence of its appearance long before the surrounding sediment hardened into stone. What remains instead is a process of reconstruction, an anatomical outline assembled by comparing fossil jaws with the living descendants that still drift through the deepest parts of the modern sea. Researchers approach the animal indirectly, beginning not with preserved tissue, but with evolutionary relationship, tracing the fossil lineage backward into the surviving serrate octopuses that inhabit abyssal waters today. Modern serrates possess one of the strangest body plans among living cephalopods. From the upper portion of the mantle rise two soft fins shaped almost like folded ears, moving in slow undulations that stabilize the animal as it drifts through dark water. 8 arms extend outward beneath a broad membrane of webbing that connects them together into a loose umbrella or bell-shaped structure. Running along the arms themselves are delicate hair-like appendages called cirri, arranged beside rows of suckers and constantly interacting with the surrounding water. Unlike shallow water octopuses that crawl across reefs or jet rapidly between rocks, serrate octopuses move with unusual softness and control. They inhabit deep marine environments exclusively, often descending thousands of meters below the surface into regions where sunlight never penetrates. No living serrate species has ever been documented inhabiting shallow coastal water. Their world is one of pressure, darkness, suspended particles, and slow drifting motion through immense open space. The fins appear to function as stabilizers and gentle propulsion systems, allowing the animals to hover efficiently with minimal energy expenditure. Rather than relying entirely on rapid bursts of jet propulsion like squids, serrates glide through the water column with controlled movements of the mantle and fins. The webbing between the arms expands outward into a broad capture surface capable of enveloping prey before guiding it inward toward the beak hidden at the center. In smaller living species, this anatomy creates an almost delicate appearance. The bodies seem soft, flexible, and loosely suspended within the surrounding water. Yet beneath that gentleness lies a remarkable biological structure. Serrate octopuses possess no rigid internal support comparable to the gladius found in squids. There is no shell remnant, no cartilage framework, no vertebral structure anchoring the body. They are composed almost entirely of muscle, nervous tissue, connective fibers, fluid, and the compact chitin beak buried at the center of the arms. Scaled upward to the estimated proportions of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, the anatomy transforms dramatically. The paired fins may have stretched across distances measured in meters rather than centimeters, broad stabilizing surfaces moving through the Cretaceous Pacific with slow, controlled pulses. The arm web, instead of forming a modest feeding membrane, could have expanded into a massive enveloping structure large enough to surround substantial prey within its folds before the beak ever made contact. The arms themselves become difficult to visualize at that scale because no living octopus provides a direct comparison. At the upper estimates, individual limbs may have extended lengths comparable to a school bus, moving not with rigid precision but with continuous muscular flexibility through open water. Every section of the body remained soft, responsive, and highly deformable despite immense overall dimensions. The mantle alone would have formed a substantial central mass suspended beneath the fins, containing the organs, gills, digestive system, and much of the animal's musculature. In large modern octopuses, the mantle already resembles a powerful muscular sac capable of dramatic expansion and contraction. In Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, reconstructed at several times that scale, the central body may have rivaled the bulk of a large terrestrial predator while remaining entirely unsupported by bone. All of it emerged from the same lineage that survives today in the abyss, as relatively small, drifting cirrates. The anatomy preserved within those living descendants became the only surviving blueprint for reconstructing an octopus that once crossed the Late Cretaceous ocean at dimensions almost no modern cephalopod approaches, carrying a body built not from skeleton and armor, but from softness, motion, and distributed intelligence moving silently through deep water. Deep inside the center of an octopus, beneath layers of muscle and surrounded by the moving architecture of the arms, sits the only hard structure the animal possesses. The beak remains hidden for most of its life, concealed within soft tissue until prey is pulled inward and the jaws begin to close. In living cephalopods, this compact structure performs nearly all of the mechanical work involved in feeding, cutting through flesh, cracking shells, and reducing captured animals into pieces small enough to consume. Its strength comes from chitin, a biological material distributed widely across the natural world, yet capable of extraordinary durability. The shells of crabs, the armored surfaces of beetles, and the exoskeletons of insects all depend upon variations of the same substance. Chitin combines flexibility with resilience, allowing biological structures to absorb repeated stress without fracturing easily. Within cephalopods, evolution shaped it into a pair of opposing curved jaws, dark and sharply edged, capable of concentrating force into remarkably small contact points. The upper beak hooks downward over the lower jaw in a tightly fitted arrangement resembling the bill of a bird of prey more than the mouth of a fish. Rather than functioning through simple vertical biting pressure, the two halves slide against one another in a shearing motion, concentrating force along the cutting edges while maintaining precise alignment. The movement allows octopuses to break hard surfaces apart gradually through compression, slicing, and rotational leverage combined. Modern octopuses already demonstrate what this anatomy can accomplish at much smaller scales. Large species routinely crack open crab shells thick enough to resist many marine predators. Others penetrate clams and bivalves through repeated pressure applied at weak structural points. Some species employ an additional organ called the radula, a ribbon-like surface lined with microscopic teeth that works beside the beak to rasp tissue and drill through protective shells. Prey that appears heavily armored from the outside often yields surprisingly quickly once the beak gains purchase. In Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, the proportions suggest a dramatic increase in mechanical capacity. The largest fossil jaw measured approximately 1.5 times the size of the beak belonging to a modern giant squid. In living octopuses, even moderate increases in beak dimensions correspond with substantial increases in muscular leverage because the jaw muscles attach across broader surfaces while maintaining concentrated cutting edges at the tips. Scaled upward across the reconstructed anatomy of Nanaimoteuthis, the implied force becomes considerable. The beak did not operate independently. Its position within the body formed part of a larger predatory system organized around capture and control. In serrate octopuses, the arms and surrounding web create a flexible enclosure capable of wrapping around prey before drawing it inward. Suckers grip and manipulate struggling animals while the membrane folds inward from multiple directions at once. The beak sits precisely at the center of this arrangement, waiting beneath the converging arms where captured prey eventually arrives. The sequence is efficient and intimate. Arms establish contact first, surrounding rather than striking. The web confines movement and reduces escape space within a living enclosure of muscle and sensory tissue. Only after the prey has been controlled does the beak emerge into direct use, applying crushing and cutting force at close range where leverage remains greatest. At the scale reconstructed for Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, the entire mechanism expands into unfamiliar dimensions. The web may have enclosed animals far larger than those consumed by living serrates. Arms stretching several meters through the water would have guided prey steadily toward the center of the body, where the beak waited concealed beneath the folds of tissue and muscle. Every preserved fossil jaw represents not merely an isolated anatomical structure, but the final stage of a coordinated feeding system refined through millions of years of cephalopod evolution. The beak itself remained small compared to the body surrounding it, yet nearly all direct evidence of Nanaimoteuthis survived through that single structure because chitin endured where softer tissue disappeared. The predator vanished. The weapon remained. Under magnification, the fossil beaks no longer appear smooth. Their surfaces carry scars accumulated slowly across lifetimes spent feeding in the Cretaceous ocean. Fine scratches run along the cutting edges. Small fractures interrupt the curved margins. Portions of the jaw tips appear rounded and worn down rather than sharply preserved. In some specimens, the damage extends deeply enough that the original contours of the beak have visibly changed through repeated mechanical stress. The patterns occur in both Nanaimoteuthis, Geological, and Nanaimoteuthis, haggarti, suggesting the behavior extended across the lineage rather than belonging to a single, unusual individual. The marks do not resemble random breakage caused during fossilization. Instead, they align with wear seen in modern cephalopods that regularly process hard prey using repeated crushing and shearing movements of the beak. Researchers examined alternative explanations carefully because fossil surfaces can be altered by geological forces long after the animal dies. Sediment pressure, chemical erosion, and transport through moving water all leave distinct signatures on preserved structures. Yet the jaw damage from Nanaimoteuthis did not match those processes well. The specimens came from deep marine sediments deposited in low-energy environments far below the reach of coastal wave action. The seafloor where these animals eventually settled remained quiet enough that delicate structures survived burial without significant abrasion from rolling rock or turbulent surf. Wave-worn fossils usually display smoother, more generalized erosion distributed broadly across exposed surfaces. The Nanaimoteuthis jaws instead carried concentrated damage precisely along the functional cutting regions where mechanical stress would be greatest during feeding. The scratches followed the direction of repeated jaw motion, Chips appeared near the active biting edges. Rounded areas formed where opposing surfaces likely contacted resistant prey again and again over long intervals. The damage implied a diet far more demanding than soft tissue feeding alone. Hard-shelled ammonites likely formed part of the prey base, moving through the late Cretaceous Pacific. Their coiled external shells, reinforced through chambered mineral construction, required substantial force to penetrate. Large crustaceans added further resistance through thick chitinous exoskeletons, already difficult for many marine predators to process. Bony fish carried dense skeletal structures that concentrated stress against the cutting surfaces of the beak during feeding. Other armored mollusks may also have contributed to the accumulated wear. The exact prey list remains uncertain because direct stomach contents or feeding traces have not survived. Yet, the physical evidence preserved in the jaws themselves points consistently toward repeated interaction with biologically hardened material, rather than occasional scavenging on soft remains drifting through the water. In the largest specimens, researchers estimated that almost 10% of the original jaw length had been lost through wear accumulated during life. For a biological feeding structure, this represents substantial long-term erosion. The damage did not occur suddenly, but developed gradually across thousands upon thousands of feeding events. Every scratch marked contact between the beak and resistant prey. Every chipped edge recorded moments of concentrated force transmitted through muscle, tissue, and chitin into something hard enough to push back against the jaws. The wear patterns also suggest persistence. Animals relying mainly on opportunistic scavenging generally experience more irregular feeding stress because carrion rarely demands repeated crushing against armored structures. Nanaimoteuthis appears instead to have engaged consistently with difficult prey requiring active mechanical processing over extended periods. The beak functioned not as a rarely used defensive structure, but as a primary predatory tool subjected to continuous work. Across approximately 14 million years of known existence, the lineage maintained that feeding strategy successfully enough to persist through changing marine ecosystems and expanding body size. The fossil jaws preserved a quiet mechanical history of those lives, written not through bone or direct observation, but through abrasion, slowly carved into chitin by the repetitive work of hunting. Long after the arms vanished and the bodies dissolved back into the ocean, the beaks still carried evidence of what they had spent their lives doing beneath the water of the late Cretaceous Pacific. The damage along the fossil jaws was not distributed evenly. When researchers compared the cutting surfaces carefully, another pattern emerged beneath the scratches and fractures. In both Nanaimoteuthis gillespie and Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, one side of the beak tip consistently showed heavier wear than the other. The asymmetry repeated itself across multiple specimens, enough that it could no longer be dismissed as random variation produced during fossilization. In some jaws, the difference reached nearly 10% of the total structure. One edge appeared more rounded, more eroded, more heavily used across the lifetime of the animal. The opposite side remained comparatively intact. The imbalance suggested repeated preference during feeding, as though the jaws contacted prey at slightly different angles again and again over thousands of feeding events. Random environmental damage rarely produces such consistency. Geological pressure may fracture fossils unpredictably, but it does not repeatedly wear down the same functional region across multiple individuals within separate specimens and localities. The asymmetry instead resembled biological behavior, accumulated through habit rather than accident. Among living animals, This kind of lateralization appears across a wide range of nervous systems. Primates favor one hand over another for manipulation and coordinated movement. Birds display turning preferences during flight and feeding. Certain fish repeatedly strike prey from one side more often than the other. In each case, the body develops asymmetrical patterns because the nervous system itself processes information unevenly between hemispheres. Different regions of the brain specialize in different tasks, and repeated behavior gradually leaves physical evidence behind. Modern octopuses already exhibit remarkably complex neural organization. Unlike vertebrates, much of their nervous system extends throughout the arms themselves, rather than remaining centralized entirely within the brain. Individual limbs can process touch, texture, and movement with substantial autonomy while still coordinating with the central nervous system. The result is a distributed form of intelligence capable of sophisticated problem-solving and highly flexible behavior. The fossil jaws from Nanaimoteuthis suggested that some degree of this specialization already existed deep within the lineage tens of millions of years ago. Yasuhiro Iba described the interpretation directly when discussing the study. In our fossils, the jaws show asymmetric wear, suggesting lateralized behavior, favoring one side over the other, something like handedness. This indicates not only strength, but also advanced and flexible behavior. The implication moved beyond simple anatomy into behavior repeated consistently enough to alter the physical structure of the beak itself. Somewhere within the feeding sequence, the animal appeared to favor one side while processing prey. The preference may have emerged through arm coordination, body orientation, or subtle asymmetries in jaw movement controlled neurologically over long periods of time. Whatever its exact origin, the pattern suggested repetition guided by the nervous system rather than random physical wear alone. It is possible to imagine the behavior almost invisibly embedded within the act of feeding. Prey drawn inward through the arms, the body rotating slightly during restraint, the beak closing at a favored angle again and again across years of hunting until the harder working side gradually wore down beneath constant pressure. Not every researcher accepts the interpretation without caution. Some paleontologists outside the study note that asymmetrical wear can arise through multiple mechanisms, including developmental irregularities, injury, or individual feeding habits unrelated to broader neural specialization. Fossils preserve only fragments of behavior, and direct conclusions about cognition from isolated structures require restraint. Yet the repeated appearance of the same asymmetry across multiple jaws makes complete dismissal difficult. The fossils do not merely record feeding damage. They preserve directional preference embedded physically into the anatomy itself. Long after the nervous tissue disappeared and the body dissolved into the Cretaceous ocean, the beak still carried traces of repeated decisions made by the living animal. Within those worn curves of chitin remains the possibility that an ancient giant octopus possessed not only immense size and predatory strength, but habits shaped by specialized neural behavior, a preferred side, a favored motion, and a subtle asymmetry carried consistently through millions of years beneath the warm waters of the Late Cretaceous Pacific. Among living animals, octopuses occupy a peculiar place in the history of intelligence. They are invertebrates, soft-bodied mollusks separated from vertebrate evolution by more than 500 million years, yet they repeatedly display behaviors associated with complex cognition. In laboratory settings and public aquariums, modern octopuses open containers, navigate puzzle mechanisms, distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar human faces, and manipulate objects with deliberate coordination. Some gather coconut shells for shelter. Others engage in exploratory play, repeatedly interacting with floating objects despite no immediate feeding reward. Their intelligence emerged along an evolutionary path entirely separate from mammals, birds, or reptiles, built within a nervous system organized in a profoundly different way. The structure of that nervous system remains one of the strangest features of cephalopod biology. In the common octopus, Octopus vulgaris, researchers estimate roughly 500 million neurons distributed throughout the body, a count comparable to that of a dog. Yet only a fraction reside within the central brain itself. Nearly 2/3 are located within the arms, where they process touch, movement, chemical signals, and local decision-making independently while still remaining connected to the animal as a whole. An octopus arm does not merely obey commands. It senses texture directly through contact. It tastes surfaces chemically through the suckers. It adjusts grip, movement, and orientation in real time, without requiring every action to route through centralized control. The result is a form of distributed cognition unlike anything present in vertebrates, a nervous system spread physically through the body itself. For Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, the implications become difficult to fully imagine because body size and nervous complexity likely expanded together. A larger animal requires greater sensory coordination simply to manage movement across a much larger physical form. Longer arms contain vastly more surface area, interacting continuously with the surrounding environment. Every extension through the water introduces streams of tactile and chemical information flowing inward from the tips of the limbs toward the central nervous system. No fossil can directly preserve thought. Intelligence leaves few traces in stone. Yet the asymmetrical wear patterns preserved in the jaws suggest that some form of lateralized neural behavior already existed within the species. The animal appeared to favor one side consistently during feeding, implying specialized coordination rather than random motion alone. Whatever cognitive capacity Nanaimoteuthis possessed, the neural architecture supporting flexible and repeated behavioral patterns was already present. Yasuhiro Iba compared the species to the orcas, or great white sharks, of the invertebrate world, not only because of its estimated scale, but because of the apparent combination of body size, predatory effectiveness, and behavioral sophistication implied by the fossil evidence. The comparison places the animal within an ecological role, requiring active sensory processing rather than passive feeding. Large mobile prey cannot be captured efficiently through simple instinctive motion alone. Pursuit, restraint, and prey handling all demand rapid coordination between perception and movement. The arms themselves would have formed an enormous sensory field moving through the Cretaceous ocean. In living octopuses, even smaller species explore their surroundings continuously through touch and chemical detection. Scaled upward across a body potentially approaching 18 meters in length, the sensory reach becomes immense. Each arm could sample broad volumes of water independently while remaining linked into a coordinated whole, gathering information across distances far exceeding those available to most modern octopuses. Nothing in the fossil evidence suggests a passive drifting animal feeding on suspended particles or dead material settling from above. The wear on the jaws, the reconstructed anatomy, and the likely prey all point toward an active predator repeatedly engaging with hard-bodied, mobile animals in open water. Such behavior requires selection, coordination, and adaptability sustained over millions of years within changing ecosystems. Exactly what Nanaimoteuthis haggarti experienced internally can never be recovered from the fossil record. The texture of its perception vanished with the soft tissue of the body itself. Yet beneath the warm waters of the late Cretaceous Pacific moved an enormous cephalopod carrying a nervous system already shaped by evolutionary pressures that, in modern octopuses, produce some of the most sophisticated non-vertebrate behavior known on Earth. Far below the surface of the late Cretaceous Pacific, movement would have emerged first as shape rather than speed. A serrate octopus does not pursue prey in the manner of a shark, nor does it strike with the sudden explosive acceleration of a squid. Its body is built for controlled motion through open water, for drifting adjustments, gradual approach, and sudden enclosure once contact becomes possible. The anatomy reconstructed from Nanaimoteuthis haggarti suggests a predator operating through capture and confinement rather than direct collision. The broad membrane connecting the arms likely formed the center of this hunting strategy. In living finned octopuses, the web can spread outward rapidly, surrounding prey within a flexible enclosure before escape routes remain available. The movement resembles the unfurling of fabric underwater, soft in appearance yet mechanically effective. Water becomes trapped briefly inside the expanding structure, along with whatever animal occupied the space at the moment of closure. Scaled upward to the dimensions estimated for Nanaimoteuthis, the same behavior becomes immense. Arms extending outward through dark water would have carried the membrane with them in a widening circular sweep, forming a temporary chamber of muscle and tissue around prey before contraction began. Fish, crustaceans, or shelled cephalopods caught inside would no longer confront a single attacking mouth, but an enclosing surface pressing inward from every direction at once. Once captured, the prey would have been guided steadily toward the center of the body. Modern octopus arms coordinate continuously during feeding, adjusting pressure and grip independently while responding to movement through touch and chemical sensation. Suckers maintain contact while the arms fold inward beneath the web, gradually reducing the available space until the prey reaches the concealed beak positioned at the center. There, the feeding process changed from restraint to mechanical destruction. The beak itself functioned through concentrated cutting and crushing force rather than tearing. Shells fractured under pressure applied repeatedly along the curved edges of chitin. Bone cracked through shearing contact. Exoskeletons split apart as the jaws rotated against resistant surfaces. Beside the beak worked the radula, a ribbon-like feeding organ lined with rows of microscopic teeth capable of scraping softened tissue inward once protective structures had been breached. The fossils suggest this process occurred repeatedly across the lifetime of the animal. The heavy wear preserved along the beaks indicates sustained interaction with hard prey rather than occasional feeding on soft-bodied animals alone. Ammonites likely formed an important part of the hunting ecology. Many late Cretaceous ammonites possessed thick, coiled shells and reached diameters exceeding a meter across. Capturing such animals would have required both strength and coordination, particularly in deeper water where visibility remained limited and prey movement occurred through darkness. Large crustaceans and heavily built fish probably formed additional targets. The beak damage implies regular exposure to resistant biological material capable of wearing down the cutting surfaces over years of use. The feeding traces resemble the accumulated history of repeated mechanical labor performed daily rather than sporadic, opportunistic scavenging. The surrounding sedimentary evidence also suggests the habitat itself differed from shallow reef ecosystems familiar to many living octopuses. The fossils originated from deeper marine deposits where oxygen levels periodically dropped and fine sediment settled slowly through calm water. Nanaimoteuthis haggarti appears to have occupied deeper water columns rather than coastal shallows, moving through environments shaped more by pressure and darkness than by sunlight or wave motion. Within that deeper world, hunting likely depended less upon rapid visual pursuit and more upon controlled sensory contact. The long arms sampled the surrounding water continuously while drifting through open space. Chemical signals, movement, and touch guided the feeding sequence long before the prey itself reached the beak. Everything preserved in the fossil jaws points toward repetition. This was not an occasional act carried out only when opportunity appeared. Across millions of years, Nanaimoteuthis haggarti seems to have performed the same sequence again and again beneath the Cretaceous Pacific, enclosing prey within its web, drawing it inward through coordinated arms, and reducing shell, bone, and flesh beneath the steady pressure of chitin and muscle in the deep water far below the surface world above. The waters of the late Cretaceous North Pacific were crowded with movement. Life occupied nearly every layer of the ocean, from the bright surface where flying reptiles skimmed for fish to the deeper water columns where giant cephalopods and marine reptiles crossed through darkness beneath them. Warm temperatures and high sea levels had transformed enormous portions of the planet into shallow inland seas and broad marine corridors, rich with prey, creating one of the most densely populated ocean ecosystems in Earth's history. Through these waters moved mosasaurs, immense marine lizards descended not from dinosaurs, but from terrestrial reptilian ancestors that had returned gradually to the sea. Their bodies had become streamlined for open water pursuit, limbs flattened into flippers, tails widened into powerful vertical paddles, capable of driving the animals forward with sustained force. Their jaws contained a second hinge joint that allowed them to open their mouths unusually wide while swallowing large prey whole. The largest mosasaurs reached lengths approaching 18 meters, placing them among the dominant vertebrate predators of the Cretaceous oceans. They hunted fish, ammonites, marine birds, smaller reptiles, and almost anything else they could overpower. Fossilized stomach contents revealed diets broad enough to include members of their own kind. In the warm Pacific basin surrounding ancient Vancouver Island and Hokkaido, these reptiles moved through the water as established rulers of the marine food web, long before the fossil jaws of Nanaimoteuthis emerged from stone. Sharing the ocean with them were elasmosaurs, the long-necked branch of the plesiosaur lineage. Their anatomy appeared almost improbable, even by Cretaceous standards. Some species carried more neck vertebrae than any other known animal in the history of life, supporting extraordinarily elongated necks, ending in relatively small heads. Their bodies remained broad and muscular, propelled through the water by 4 large flippers, moving in coordinated strokes beneath the torso. Elasmosaurs likely hunted through slower ambush strategies, extending their necks toward schools of fish or soft-bodied prey, while the heavier body remained farther behind. In deeper water, the long neck may have allowed careful approach without disturbing nearby prey through sudden body movement. Around them drifted dense populations of cephalopods, fish, and crustaceans, feeding continuously within the warm, productive sea. Sharks occupied another layer of the ecosystem entirely. Cretoxer rhinomantelli, sometimes called the Ginsu shark, cut through the water with a body built for speed and active pursuit. Reaching lengths around 6 meters, it hunted in warm marine environments using serrated teeth capable of slicing through flesh efficiently. Fossil evidence suggests it preyed upon large fish and marine reptiles alike. Nearby moved Squalocorax, a smaller crow shark roughly 2 meters long, likely functioning more often as a scavenger than an apex predator, feeding opportunistically within the crowded food web. The bony fish of the Cretaceous were no less formidable. Cephalopod, among the largest predatory fish of the era, reached approximately 5 meters in length and carried long fang-like teeth within an enormous gape. Some fossil specimens preserve entire prey animals inside the body cavity, swallowed before digestion could begin. Their elongated bodies moved rapidly through open water schools, hunting smaller fish across the same marine basin occupied by reptiles and giant cephalopods alike. Everywhere through the ocean drifted ammonites, their coiled shells ranging from palm-sized spirals to structures exceeding a meter across. They formed one of the foundational prey groups of the Cretaceous seas, consumed by mosasaurs, fish, sharks, and likely Nanaimoteuthis itself. Their shells accumulated on the seafloor after death, joining belemnites and countless other marine remains, settling slowly into sediment beneath the water column. Above the surface, pterosaurs crossed the air currents. Pteranodon and related species carried wingspans exceeding 7 meters, gliding over the ocean before diving toward schools of fish near the surface. Their shadows moved briefly across the water, while far below them another predator drifted unseen through deeper layers of the sea. Into this immense ecosystem entered an octopus, potentially rivaling or exceeding the size of nearly everything around it, moving not through bone and scales, but through muscle, intelligence, and soft tissue concealed beneath the warm waters of the Late Cretaceous Pacific. For most of paleontological history, the structure of ancient marine ecosystems appeared straightforward. The dominant predators were assumed to belong to the vertebrates, first armored fish and sharks, then marine reptiles, and eventually whales in later oceans. Size, mobility, and ecological control seemed consistently tied to animals built around internal skeletons and powerful vertebral bodies. Invertebrates occupied important roles within those ecosystems, sometimes abundant, sometimes enormous, but rarely interpreted as the organisms controlling the uppermost predatory tier. The fossils of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti complicated that picture quietly but profoundly. The estimated body size alone placed the animal within the same broad dimensions as the largest mosasaurs inhabiting the North Pacific during the Late Cretaceous. Its feeding traces indicated repeated interaction with resistant prey rather than passive scavenging or small-scale opportunism. The reconstructed anatomy suggested an active hunter capable of capturing large, mobile animals within deep water environments. Combined together, those lines of evidence implied something unusual. This octopus did not appear to occupy a lower supporting niche beneath the dominant reptiles. It occupied a neighboring tier. Yasuhiro Iba addressed the implication directly while discussing the study. For roughly the past 370 million years, marine ecosystems have been thought to be dominated by large vertebrate predators, first fishes and sharks, then marine reptiles and later whales. Our study shows that giant invertebrates, namely octopuses, also functioned as apex predators in the Cretaceous Sea. The statement carried consequences extending beyond the animal itself. Apex predators influence ecosystems disproportionately through feeding pressure, competition, and control over prey distribution. When multiple large predators share overlapping resources, they shape one another evolutionarily across long periods of time. Hunting strategies shift, prey populations adapt. Entire food webs reorganize around the interactions between competing top consumers. Nanaimoteuthis haggarti appears to have existed within precisely that ecological space. At comparable body lengths to the largest mosasaurs, and with evidence suggesting regular predation on hard-bodied prey, it likely occupied the same upper layers of marine predation rather than existing beneath them. Iba describe the possibility in similarly direct terms. These giant octopuses likely occupied the same ecological tier and may have competed with marine reptiles and sharks within the same ecosystem. Competition does not necessarily require direct combat between predators. It emerges whenever multiple species depend upon overlapping prey resources within the same environment. Large ammonites, fish, and crustaceans formed abundant food sources across the Late Cretaceous Pacific. Mosasaurs consumed them, sharks consumed them, giant octopuses likely consumed them as well. Through millions of years, each lineage would have exerted selective pressure not only upon prey populations, but indirectly upon one another. The broader implication is difficult to ignore. The North Pacific of the Late Cretaceous may not have been a vertebrate-dominated ecosystem, with invertebrates restricted to secondary roles. Instead, two entirely separate branches of animal evolution appear to have reached comparable predatory status simultaneously. One lineage arrived there through bone, vertebrae, jaws, and muscular tails. The other arrived through distributed nervous systems, soft tissue, and chitin beaks concealed within webs of arms. Not every paleontologist fully accepts the strongest interpretation of this ecological framing. Some researchers outside the study urge greater caution regarding direct competition with large marine reptiles. Adiel Klompmaker and Jakob Vinther have both noted that the available fossil evidence does not demonstrate active predation upon mosasaurs or other large vertebrates. Specifically, the preserved wear patterns point more confidently toward hard-shelled invertebrates and fish than toward enormous reptilian prey. The distinction matters scientifically because ecological overlap can exist without identical diets. Yet even under more conservative interpretations, Nanaimoteuthis haggarti still emerges as an unusually large and behaviorally sophisticated predator operating near the upper boundaries of the ecosystem rather than beneath them. For hundreds of millions of years, vertebrates seemed to define the shape of marine dominance almost by default. Then a handful of fossil jaws from the Late Cretaceous Pacific suggested that, for at least one interval in Earth's history, an octopus lineage may have risen into the same predatory tier beside them, moving through the same ocean at comparable scale, beneath waters crowded with reptiles, sharks, fish, and drifting ammonites. Long before vertebrates dominated the oceans, the ancestors of cephalopods drifted through ancient seas inside external shells. Their bodies remained protected within hard mineral chambers that provided buoyancy and defense, but limited flexibility and speed. At nearly the same time, distant vertebrate ancestors carried their own forms of armor, heavy exterior plating that shielded vulnerable tissue beneath rigid surfaces. The two lineages were separated by immense evolutionary distance, belonging to fundamentally different branches of animal life, yet over hundreds of millions of years they underwent strangely similar transformations. Both groups gradually abandoned external protection in exchange for mobility. Among vertebrates, thick armored exteriors diminished across successive marine predators as bodies became streamlined for faster swimming and more active pursuit. Fish evolved flexible skeletons and increasingly efficient jaws. Marine reptiles later refined those designs further, trading defensive heaviness for speed, maneuverability, and larger predatory range. Cephalopods followed a parallel trajectory entirely independently. Some retained external shells, as the nautilus still does today, but others reduced the shell internally or lost it altogether. Squids retained only a thin, internal support structure. Octopuses abandoned the shell almost completely, becoming soft-bodied predators capable of extraordinary flexibility and movement through confined spaces and open water alike. The result in both lineages was remarkably similar. As armor disappeared, predatory efficiency increased. Bodies became faster, more agile, and more responsive to the demands of active hunting within crowded marine ecosystems. At the center of this transformation sat the jaw. In vertebrates, jaws evolved from modified gill structures into highly adaptable feeding mechanisms capable of grasping, cutting, crushing, and processing prey. In cephalopods, the beak emerged through entirely different anatomical origins, formed from chitin rather than bone, yet achieving strikingly comparable functionality. Both systems concentrated force into compact cutting structures positioned at the center of increasingly active predatory bodies. This process is known as convergent evolution, separate evolutionary pathways arriving independently at similar biological solutions because the surrounding environmental pressures favor the same functional outcomes. Evolution does not plan in advance, yet under similar physical conditions it often produces recurring patterns. Wings appear in birds, bats, and insects through unrelated origins. Streamlined body shapes emerge repeatedly in fast marine swimmers. Predatory jaws evolve again and again because they solve the same ecological problem efficiently. Nanaimoteuthis haggarti exists within that larger pattern. Its fossil jaws suggest that cephalopods reach toward the same apex predatory role traditionally associated with vertebrates, not by imitating them consciously, but by responding to identical physical pressures within the ocean itself. Active hunting rewards mobility. Mobility rewards lighter bodies. Predation upon hard prey rewards concentrated cutting structures. Across immense spans of geological time, two unrelated branches of animal life moved gradually toward similar outcomes because the marine environment consistently favored those traits. One lineage descended from ancient mollusks. The other emerged from deuterostomes that would eventually give rise to fish, reptiles, mammals, and humans. Their anatomies remained profoundly different beneath the surface similarities. Vertebrates relied upon internal skeletons and centralized nervous systems. Cephalopods depended upon distributed neural tissue, soft muscular bodies, and chitin beaks hidden beneath webs of arms. Yet both arrived at forms capable of occupying the upper predatory layers of marine ecosystems. The implication extends beyond Nanaimoteuthis itself. Apex predation may not represent a uniquely vertebrate achievement at all. Instead, it may emerge repeatedly whenever ocean conditions reward the same combination of mobility, sensory coordination, and feeding efficiency. The ocean shapes predators according to physical laws that remain constant, regardless of ancestry. Water resists movement. Prey attempts escape. Energy must be gained more efficiently than it is spent. Organisms capable of solving those problems effectively tend to survive and expand across evolutionary time. Vertebrates solved them one way. Cephalopods solved them another. By the Late Cretaceous, both lineages had produced giant marine hunters sharing the same ocean basin simultaneously. One carried bone, scales, and hinged vertebral jaws. The other drifted through the water on a body built almost entirely from muscle and nervous tissue. Armed with a chitin beak, evolved independently toward the same ecological purpose. The convergence was not coincidence. It was the ocean repeatedly shaping life toward the forms most capable of ruling within it. The fossil record of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti ends quietly. No dramatic extinction boundary marks its disappearance. No layer of ash or iridium traces the final collapse of the lineage. The jaws simply stop appearing in sediments younger than approximately 72 million years old, vanishing from the known record several million years before the asteroid impact that would later end the age of non-avian dinosaurs and transform life across the planet. Nanaimoteuthis gillespie disappears at roughly the same point. Both known species fade from the fossil record near the transition between the Campanian and Maastrichtian stages of the Late Cretaceous, a period when marine ecosystems across the world were already beginning to shift in subtle but important ways. The oceans themselves were changing. Sea levels, which had remained extraordinarily high through much of the Cretaceous, had begun a gradual long-term regression. Shallow marine corridors narrowed, coastlines shifted slowly across continental margins. Ocean circulation patterns altered as basins changed shape and water exchange between regions evolved over time. Chemical conditions within the oceans fluctuated as climate systems adjusted across millions of years. At the same time, mosasaurs continued expanding in diversity and ecological dominance. Some lineages reached their greatest sizes during the Maastrichtian, filling marine ecosystems with increasingly specialized reptilian predators. Sharks diversified as well, occupying broad predatory niches across both coastal and open ocean environments. The late Cretaceous seas remained rich with life, but the balance within those ecosystems was not static. Predator communities evolved continuously as prey populations, temperature gradients, and ocean chemistry shifted together. Exactly how those changes affected Nanaimoteuthis remains unknown. One possibility is that the lineage truly disappeared around 72 million years ago through ecological decline. Large predators exist within delicate, energetic balances. Even modest disruptions to prey availability can place substantial pressure upon organisms requiring enormous caloric intake to maintain large active bodies. If ammonite populations shifted, if deep water oxygen conditions changed, or if competition intensified across overlapping food webs, giant serrate octopuses may have struggled to persist within increasingly unstable ecosystems. The decline may also have emerged gradually rather than catastrophically. Evolutionary lineages often contract geographically before vanishing entirely from the fossil record. Populations become fragmented, habitats narrow, reproductive success declines across generations long before extinction finally arrives. For a soft-bodied cephalopod lineage, already poorly represented in the fossil record, such a contraction could erase most direct evidence of survival even before the final individuals disappeared. Yet another possibility remains equally important. The genus may have survived well beyond 72 million years ago, leaving behind fossils that simply have not yet been recovered. The fossil record of octopuses is extraordinarily incomplete because almost the entire body decomposes rapidly after death. Preservation depends upon unusual conditions, aligning precisely enough for the chitin beak to survive burial and eventual fossilization. Entire populations may have lived and died without leaving recognizable traces behind. The known fossils of Nanaimoteuthis already represent a tiny accidental sample preserved under rare deep water conditions. Vast stretches of its evolutionary history may remain entirely invisible. Digital fossil mining techniques continue to uncover specimens previously hidden within museum collections and unexamined rock samples. It remains possible that younger fossils exist unnoticed inside sediments already collected decades ago, waiting for imaging technologies capable of revealing them. The apparent disappearance of the lineage may partly reflect the limitations of current discovery rather than the true endpoint of the animals themselves. Still, based on the evidence presently available, Nanaimoteuthis haggarti vanished before the asteroid. When the Chicxulub impact eventually struck the Earth, approximately 66 million years ago, the giant octopus lineage, described by the fossil jaws, had already disappeared from known oceans for millions of years. The mosasaurs, ammonites, and countless other marine organisms would soon follow. But Nanaimoteuthis seems to have slipped away earlier during the slower ecological transitions preceding the final catastrophe, fading from the sea before the terminal violence that closed the Cretaceous itself. Far below the surface of the modern ocean, beyond the reach of sunlight and storms, small finned octopuses still drift through the dark water with slow and deliberate movements. Their bodies pulse gently against the immense pressure of the deep sea. Ear-like fins rise and fall along the sides of the mantle, keeping them suspended above the seafloor in a world where almost nothing moves quickly. They pass through black water more than 1,000 meters beneath the waves, carrying within them the surviving anatomy of a lineage that once produced giants. The order Cerata did not vanish with Nanaimoteuthis haggarti. It endured. Modern serrate octopuses remain among the least observed large animals on Earth because they inhabit some of the deepest marine environments accessible to life. Many species spend their existence between roughly 1,000 and 7,000 meters below the surface, descending into cold regions where sunlight never penetrates and food arrives only slowly from the waters above. Human encounters with them are rare. Most observations come from deep submersibles or remotely operated vehicles moving quietly through the dark. Among the best-known living representatives is the Dumbo octopus, belonging to the genus Nanaimoteuthis. The name comes from the pair of fins extending from the mantle, structures that resemble the oversized ears of the animated elephant from the old Disney film. In the darkness of the abyss, those fins function not as decoration, but as delicate propulsive surfaces, allowing the animal to glide with remarkable stability through still water. Compared to the immense scale reconstructed for Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, modern Dumbo octopuses appear almost fragile. Most species reach lengths of only around 20 to 30 centimeters. Even the largest confirmed individuals remain modest in size, measuring approximately 1.8 meters from arm tip to arm tip. Their prey is similarly restrained. They feed upon worms, small crustaceans, copepods, and soft-bodied invertebrates gathered from the seafloor or captured slowly within the arm web. Yet the body plan remains unmistakably connected. The cirri lining the arms still wave beside rows of suckers. The webbing still stretches between the arms in a broad membranous cloak. The fins still rise from the mantle in the same arrangement inferred from the fossil jaws of the Cretaceous species. Even after tens of millions of years, the architecture survives with extraordinary continuity, preserved not in stone, but in living tissue. The scale, however, changed dramatically. At some point after the disappearance of Nanaimoteuthis, the lineage retreated downward into the deep ocean and diminished in size. The reasons remain uncertain. Large active predators require immense energy, and the deep sea offers relatively limited food resources compared with the warm, productive oceans of the late Cretaceous. Gigantism may simply have become unsustainable as marine ecosystems transformed through extinction events, climate shifts, and changing prey communities across geological time. The deep ocean also rewards efficiency over speed. Modern serrate octopuses move slowly, conserving energy in environments where meals may be separated by long periods of searching. Their gelatinous tissues and reduced musculature suit a world of cold water and sparse resources rather than the heavily populated predator-rich seas once inhabited by their ancestors. Still, evolution did not erase the lineage, it reshaped it. A Dumbo octopus, hovering quietly 6,000 meters beneath the Pacific, carries within its anatomy an uninterrupted biological inheritance extending back approximately 86 million years. The same fundamental design that once supported a predator possibly rivaling mosasaurs in size now persists in small drifting animals scarcely larger than a household cat. The continuity feels almost improbable. Entire dynasties of marine reptiles vanished, ammonites disappeared completely, countless other cephalopod lineages fractured and vanished into extinction. Yet the serrates remained, withdrawing into darkness rather than disappearing from the earth. The line did not break. It simply became smaller, quieter, and harder to find, descending into the deepest water while still carrying the ancient shape of a vanished giant. Science often advances in quiet disagreements rather than sudden certainty. Long after the fossil jaws of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti were measured, scanned, reconstructed, and compared against living relatives, the discussion surrounding them continued to move through laboratories, universities, museums, and late-night conversations between paleontologists studying the same evidence from different angles. The fossils themselves remained unchanged, dark, curved fragments resting beneath careful lights, while the meaning carried inside those shapes continued to shift gently with interpretation. The greatest point of tension centered on scale. The upper estimate of approximately 18.6 meters transformed the animal from merely unusual into something bordering on biologically astonishing. Reaching that figure required researchers to extrapolate from the lower jaw hood length using anatomical relationships observed in living serrate octopuses. Yet modern finned octopuses are small, elusive deep-sea animals rarely recovered intact. Fresh measurements are uncommon, and complete growth data across the group remains limited. The deeper the calculation traveled from the original fossil measurement, the more uncertainty entered the reconstruction. Some paleontologists accepted the estimate as plausible within the available evidence. Others urged restraint, emphasizing how dramatically body proportions can vary among cephalopods. A jaw belonging to one species may correspond neatly with total body size, while another species with a nearly identical jaw could possess very different arm lengths, mantle proportions, or tissue mass. Soft-bodied animals complicate scaling relationships because so much of their anatomy leaves no permanent record. Within the lower end of the estimate, roughly 6.6 meters, the animal already becomes immense by octopus standards. At the upper end, it enters a category with few living comparisons at all. Critics noted that the full range effectively contains two different ecological interpretations, one describing a very large deep-sea octopus, the other describing a creature rivaling the largest marine reptiles of its era. The asymmetrical wear pattern on the jaws generated another careful debate. Across multiple fossils, one side of the beak consistently showed heavier erosion than the other. The original researchers interpreted this pattern as evidence of lateralized behavior, something comparable to handedness, implying specialized neural processing and flexible behavioral habits. In living animals, lateralization often accompanies increasingly complex nervous systems. Still, caution remained important. Asymmetry in biological structures can emerge through many pathways. Injury may alter feeding mechanics across an animal's lifetime. Developmental irregularities can change how force distributes through a jaw. Repeated feeding habits do not always require advanced cognition. Some researchers argued that linking asymmetrical wear directly to intelligence risked moving beyond what the fossils alone could securely support. The ecological interpretation drew similar discussion. The original study proposed that Nanaimoteuthis occupied an apex predatory tier comparable to mosasaurs and large marine reptiles inhabiting the same ocean. Its size, predatory beak wear, and inferred hunting behavior suggested an active hunter rather than a passive scavenger. Yet, some paleontologists observed that the evidence currently points most strongly toward hard-shelled prey, such as ammonites, crustaceans, and large fish. Direct evidence of attacks on giant vertebrates does not exist. Sharing an ecosystem with mosasaurs does not automatically place two predators in identical ecological roles. Marine food webs are layered and complex, with different hunters exploiting different prey sizes, depths, and strategies, even within the same waters. What makes the discussion compelling is that none of these objections dismiss the discovery itself. The fossils are real. The beaks are genuine. The classification revision placing these animals among finned octopuses remains strongly supported by the anatomy of the jaws. The existence of large predatory serrate octopuses during the Late Cretaceous is not seriously disputed. The uncertainty lives instead in the outer edges of interpretation, within the precise scale of the animal, the degree of its intelligence, and the exact ecological position it occupied in those ancient seas. In that sense, the conversation surrounding Nanaimoteuthis haggarti reflects something deeply familiar within paleontology itself, a science built from fragments, where entire vanished worlds must often be reconstructed from the smallest surviving pieces of bone, shell, or chitin resting quietly inside stone. Long before the name Nanaimoteuthis haggarti appeared in scientific journals, the animal existed only as fragments resting silently inside stone from the eastern coast of Vancouver Island. Small, dark jaws lay embedded within layers of marine sediment deposited during the Late Cretaceous, hidden beneath forests, cliffs, and tidal outcrops shaped by millions of years of erosion. The creature itself had vanished tens of millions of years earlier, yet the slow geological processes preserving its remains continued patiently beneath the surface of the modern world. Its eventual rediscovery did not begin inside a laboratory. Some of the earliest fossils were recovered by amateur collectors, exploring exposures of the Nanaimo group, a long sequence of sedimentary rock stretching across parts of Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands of British Columbia. These collectors were not searching for fame or expecting to uncover evidence of one of the largest predatory invertebrates ever proposed. They were people moving carefully along rocky shorelines and weathered slopes, examining stone for the subtle patterns that signal something ancient hidden within. That quiet attention mattered. Fossil discovery often begins not with dramatic excavation but with recognition, the ability to notice when a curve, texture, or color inside the rock does not belong to the surrounding sediment. The beaks of Nanaimoteuthis were small compared to the enormous body they once served, yet their preserved chitin retained shapes distinct enough for experienced eyes to separate them from ordinary stone. The fossils eventually reached the Courtenay and District Museum and Paleontological Center in British Columbia, where they entered collections alongside countless other remains from the Cretaceous seas of Western Canada. There they remained for years, catalogued and protected, studied but not yet fully understood. Museums often function this way, less like final destinations and more like archives waiting for future generations to ask different questions of the same material. The geological framework surrounding those fossils had already been shaped in large part through the work of Jim Haggard, a researcher with the Geological Survey of Canada who spent years documenting the marine fossil record of the region. His research helped establish the ages, relationships, and environmental context of the rock layers composing the Nanaimo group. Without that framework, isolated fossils would remain disconnected objects. Geological context gives fossils meaning, anchoring them within time, environment, and evolutionary history. When Yasuhiro Iba and his colleagues later recognized the significance of the larger species, they named it Nanaimoteuthis haggarti in his honor, placing Haggart's name permanently within the taxonomy of an animal that vanished from the Earth approximately 72 million years ago. The genus name itself carries its own layered history. Nanaimoteuthis combines Nanaimo, referencing the geological formation where the fossils were found, with the Greek word teuthis, meaning squid. At the time the genus was originally established, researchers believed the animal belonged closer to squid-like cephalopods within the vampire squid lineage. Later, reanalysis shifted the classification toward finned octopuses of the order Cerata, leaving the name as a small fossil of scientific history in its own right, preserving an earlier interpretation even after understanding evolved. The smaller species, Nanaimoteuthis gilletsky, honored another researcher whose work contributed to the study of ancient cephalopods. Across paleontology, these names become quiet memorials, linking living scientists to vanished ecosystems through Latinized fragments carried forward into future research. What makes the story unusually gentle is how long the fossils waited before their full significance emerged. The specimens rested inside museum drawers, while technology advanced outside them. New imaging systems appeared. Digital reconstruction methods improved. Artificial intelligence entered paleontology. Then researchers from Hokkaido University returned to the old material with tools unavailable to the people who first discovered it. The fossils themselves had not changed. The stone remained the same. The jaws remained the same. What changed was the ability to see more clearly into what had already been there all along, hidden patiently inside the rock, waiting for the right moment in human history to come into focus. Inside museum storage rooms around the world, countless fossils remain hidden in plain sight. Stone blocks, gathered decades earlier, rest quietly in drawers and cabinets, each labeled, cataloged, and often only partially understood. Paleontologists once depended almost entirely on what the eye could see at the rock surface or what careful mechanical preparation could physically expose without destroying the specimen itself. Entire branches of ancient life remained inaccessible simply because they were buried too deeply inside the stone, invisible beneath layers of sediment that no chisel could safely remove. For most of paleontology's history, the limits of knowledge were tied directly to physical visibility. The study of Nanaimoteuthis helped reveal how quickly that boundary is beginning to change. The technique used by the Hokkaido University team is known as digital fossil mining, a process that transforms solid rock into enormous image datasets capable of being explored layer by layer inside a computer. The method begins with grinding tomography. A fossil-bearing rock sample is shaved away gradually in extremely thin increments. After each microscopic layer is removed, the newly exposed surface is photographed at very high resolution. Then another thin layer is ground away and photographed again. The process repeats thousands of times. Eventually, the entire interior of the rock becomes preserved as a complete stack of sequential cross-sectional images. When digitally reconstructed, those images form a precise three-dimensional map of structures hidden inside the stone long before the physical sample itself has fully disappeared. Within those dense image data sets, the researchers applied a form of artificial intelligence known as zero-shot learning. Traditional machine learning systems generally require large training libraries containing many examples of the exact object they are expected to identify. Zero-shot learning operates differently. Instead of memorizing one narrow category, it generalizes from broader visual relationships and structural patterns. In practical terms, the system could identify shapes resembling cephalopod jaws even when it had never been trained specifically on Nanaimoteuthis fossils themselves. That distinction mattered enormously. Many of the fossil beaks, embedded inside the rock, were only partially preserved or visually blended into the surrounding sediment. Conventional preparation methods likely would never have exposed them clearly, and attempting to carve them free mechanically carried a high risk of damage. Yet the artificial intelligence system moved through thousands of internal image slices, recognizing subtle curves, densities, and textures corresponding to hidden jaw structures buried entirely beyond human sight. 12 of the 27 fossil specimens analyzed in the study emerged only because of this process. Without digital fossil mining, those animals would have remained permanently invisible inside museum rock samples already sitting on shelves. The implications stretch far beyond a single giant octopus. Museum collections across the world contain immense numbers of unopened or partially prepared geological samples recovered over more than a century of paleontological fieldwork. Many were collected during expeditions where time, funding, or available technology limited how extensively the material could be studied. In some cases, researchers preserved large blocks simply because something promising appeared at the surface, even though deeper contents remained inaccessible. Now, those older collections are beginning to resemble archives waiting for re-examination rather than completed discoveries. Digital fossil mining offers a way to investigate hidden interiors without relying solely on destructive physical preparation. Combined with increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence systems, paleontology is moving toward a future where fossils may be recovered not only from remote deserts or cliffsides, but from museum drawers already assembled generations earlier. The fossils are often already there. What changes is the ability to perceive them. For soft-bodied animals especially, creatures that rarely leave durable remains behind, this shift may become transformative. Tiny traces overlooked for decades can now emerge from inside stone through computational reconstruction and pattern recognition impossible for earlier researchers to achieve. Entire populations of ancient organisms may still rest concealed within existing collections, preserved but unseen. In that sense, the discovery of Nanaimoteuthis does not only describe a vanished animal from the late Cretaceous ocean, it also marks a quiet turning point in how paleontology itself observes the past, moving beyond the surface of the rock and into the hidden interiors where ancient life has been waiting silently all along. Long before vertebrates rose into the oceans as dominant hunters, before mosasaurs crossed the warm Cretaceous seas or sharks refined the streamlined forms familiar today, cephalopods were already moving through ancient water. Their history extends back approximately 500 million years into the Cambrian period, when the oceans of Earth were still crowded with strange early animal lineages experimenting with entirely new body plans. Within that distant world, the first cephalopods emerged as soft-bodied mollusks protected by external shells, drifting through shallow seas beneath skies almost unimaginably ancient. Those earliest forms moved slowly. The shell provided buoyancy and protection, allowing the animal to control depth within the water column, but armor imposed limits. Heavy external shells constrained speed and maneuverability. Over immense stretches of evolutionary time, different cephalopod lineages began modifying that original design in different ways, each adjustment gradually changing how these animals interacted with the ocean around them. Some retained the ancestral structure. The modern nautilus still carries its coiled external shell through the Indo-Pacific today, moving through dim tropical waters in a form remarkably similar to relatives that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. Inside its shell, chambers regulate buoyancy, much as they did in deep geological time, preserving one surviving branch of an ancient design. Other cephalopods moved in a different direction. Squids and cuttlefish internalized the shell, reducing it into lighter structures embedded within the body. The shell no longer functioned as external armor, but remained present as a hidden support. Freed from the burden of carrying a large, protective exterior, these animals gained greater flexibility, faster movement, and more efficient predatory behavior. The octopus lineage traveled furthest of all. At some point, deep in evolutionary history, the shell disappeared entirely. What remained was an animal built almost completely from muscle, neural tissue, and soft connective structures surrounding a hardened chitinous beak. The loss of armor carried obvious vulnerability, yet it also unlocked extraordinary mobility. Without rigid constraints, octopuses could compress their bodies into narrow spaces, manipulate objects with unprecedented dexterity, and move through the environment with astonishing fluidity. The pattern repeated again and again across cephalopod evolution. Protection diminished, mobility increased, predatory sophistication deepened. Meanwhile, other cephalopod branches achieved enormous scale while still retaining shells. Ammonites, distant relatives of the nautilus, spread through global oceans for more than 300 million years. Their coiled shells ranged from tiny forms, scarcely larger than a coin, to giants exceeding 1.5 meters across in species such as Parapuzotia. Throughout the Mesozoic seas, they became among the most abundant and successful marine predators on Earth before vanishing at the end of the Cretaceous, alongside countless other lineages. Even earlier, during the Cambrian and Ordovician periods, giant-shelled cephalopods already occupied apex roles within marine ecosystems. Some orthoconic species developed long, straight shells extending several meters in length, dominating ancient seas hundreds of millions of years before the appearance of dinosaurs. Against that immense background, Nanaimoteuthis haggarti appears not as an isolated anomaly, but as part of a recurring evolutionary pattern. Again and again, when ocean conditions became warm, productive, and rich in prey, cephalopods expanded toward gigantism. Different body plans reached toward large-scale predation through different anatomical solutions, yet the outcome remained remarkably consistent. The oceans repeatedly produced giant cephalopods whenever environmental conditions allowed the energetic demands of such animals to be sustained. The Late Cretaceous North Pacific represented one of those windows. Warm global temperatures, extensive shallow seas, abundant prey populations, and immense marine ecosystems created conditions capable of supporting predators at extraordinary scale. Within that world, the Surrate octopus lineage produced Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, an animal potentially rivaling the largest marine reptiles inhabiting the same waters. Seen across the full sweep of cephalopod history, its existence feels less like an impossible accident and more like the reappearance of an ancient tendency already written deeply into the lineage itself. Cephalopods have approached apex scale many times across Earth's history. The forms changed, the oceans changed, the predators changed, but the capacity remained. The fossil jaws of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti carry extraordinary weight for such small remains. From them emerged estimates of body size, hints of feeding behavior, evidence of asymmetrical wear, and even tentative glimpses into the possible structure of a vanished predator's nervous system. Yet surrounding every conclusion is an immense perimeter of uncertainty, a wide, dark space where the animal itself disappears beyond the reach of evidence. The farther reconstruction moves away from the preserved beak, the more the creature dissolves into silence. No trace of its skin survives. Modern octopuses possess some of the most sophisticated camouflage systems known in the animal kingdom. Beneath their skin lie chromatophores, pigment-containing cells capable of expanding and contracting in fractions of a second. By controlling these structures, octopuses alter color, brightness, and pattern with astonishing speed, blending into coral, stone, sand, or shadow almost instantly. Some species layer this with iridescent cells and reflective tissues that shift appearance dynamically as light changes around them. What Nanaimoteuthis looked like beneath the water remains completely unknown. Modern deep-sea serrate octopuses are often pale, reddish, or translucent, colors suited for the low-light conditions of the abyss. Yet the late Cretaceous seas, inhabited by Nanaimoteuthis, differed profoundly from modern deep oceans. Water chemistry, prey communities, predator pressures, and light environments were not the same. Whether the giant octopus drifted through darkness as a pale shape or carried darker pigmentation adapted for concealment within deeper water cannot be determined from the fossils. Its lifespan is equally uncertain. Most modern octopus species live remarkably short lives, often surviving only 1 or 2 years. Even giant Pacific octopuses rarely live beyond a handful of years before reproduction and death. Giant squid may persist somewhat longer, perhaps 3 to 5 years, though direct data remains limited because so few complete life histories have ever been observed. An octopus approaching the reconstructed scale of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti may have required a different biological rhythm entirely. Large bodies often develop more slowly and demand longer maturation periods. Yet no preserved growth structures exist to measure age directly. No soft tissue survives to reveal metabolism, reproductive timing, or developmental rate. The beak records feeding wear but not the passage of years. Reproduction remains hidden as well. Modern octopuses generally follow a terminal reproductive strategy. Females lay eggs, guard them intensely, and eventually die soon after hatching occurs. Some deep-sea octopuses brood eggs for astonishing lengths of time under cold conditions, remaining with them for years while barely feeding. Whether Nanaimoteuthis followed similar patterns is impossible to know. The size of its eggs, the number produced, the location of nesting sites, and the behavior surrounding reproduction all vanished without trace. Even its movement through the water cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Living serrate octopuses primarily rely upon gentle fin propulsion, drifting slowly through the deep sea with controlled movements rather than rapid bursts of jet-driven acceleration. Their gelatinous tissues favor energy efficiency over speed, yet scaling that body plan to the immense proportions proposed for Nanaimoteuthis introduces unanswered biomechanical questions. Large animals interact with water differently. Momentum, drag, and muscular demand shift dramatically with increasing size. Perhaps it moves slowly through deeper water columns with broad, steady fin strokes. Perhaps it combined fin movement with periodic jet propulsion from the mantle cavity. No preserved muscle arrangement survives to answer the question. Its social behavior also remains entirely inaccessible. Modern serrate octopuses are generally considered solitary animals. Encounters between individuals appear infrequent in the deep sea, where prey resources remain dispersed and environmental density stays low. Yet modern serrates are also small creatures inhabiting nutrient-limited environments. Whether gigantism altered social behavior in Nanaimoteuthis cannot be inferred from fossils alone. The central truth remains almost unsettling in its simplicity. Everything known about this immense animal originates from the survival of hardened jaws composed of chitin buried within ancient marine sediment. No arms remain, no eyes, no mantle tissue, no nervous system, no preserved skin. The beak endured, and from that narrow fragment, an entire vanished predator slowly emerged into view, surrounded on all sides by the immense and permanent silence of deep time. Long before Vancouver Island carried forests, roads, or towns along its eastern shore, the ground beneath it belonged to an ocean basin descending slowly into darkness. Fine sediment drifted downward through warm Late Cretaceous water in a steady rain that lasted millions of years, settling grain by grain across a quiet seafloor where almost nothing disturbed the accumulating layers. The jaws of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti entered that stillness as fragments of once living tissue, descending through deep water until they vanished into mud that would eventually harden into stone. That seafloor no longer exists in its original form. 86 million years ago, the western margin of North America looked profoundly different from the coastline visible today. The Pacific Rim was already restless, shaped by continual tectonic collision and subduction. Chains of volcanic islands rose offshore, oceanic crust slid downward beneath continental edges. Entire regions shifted laterally over immense spans of time, carried by geological forces moving at speeds almost impossible to perceive within a human life. The sediments preserving the fossils belonged to the Nanaimo group, a vast succession of late Cretaceous sedimentary rocks extending along eastern Vancouver Island. Within that sequence, the Pender Formation formed part of a four-arc basin, a long, depressed trough caught between a volcanic island arc and the continental margin beyond it. As tectonic plates converged, the basin subsided gradually downward, creating space for immense quantities of sediment to accumulate. Mud, volcanic ash, silt, and organic debris drifted into the basin continuously. Rivers carried material from nearby land masses. Marine organisms died in the overlying waters and settled slowly toward the bottom, layer upon layer, compressed over time into dense stone. In some intervals, oxygen near the seafloor became depleted enough to slow bacterial decay, allowing fragile organic structures a rare opportunity to survive burial before decomposition erased them entirely. Within those low oxygen sediments, the chitinous jaws endured. Above them, geological time continued its immense work. More sediment accumulated overhead, eventually burying the ancient seafloor beneath kilometers of additional rock. Pressure increased, minerals shifted. Water moved slowly through buried sediments. The basin itself deformed under continuing tectonic stress as the Pacific margin evolved through millions upon millions of years. Then the direction of motion changed. The same tectonic forces that once pulled the basin downward gradually lifted portions of it upward again. Compression folded rock layers, faults displaced ancient sediments toward the surface. Erosion removed overlying material grain by grain, exposing rocks that had once rested far beneath the ocean. Mountain building across what is now British Columbia carried fragments of the ancient basin steadily closer to daylight. The process unfolded with almost immeasurable slowness. A human civilization would pass before a mountain ridge changed visibly. Entire species emerged and vanished, while those buried sediments rose only a little farther toward the surface. Rain, frost, roots, rivers, and coastal erosion continued the work tectonics began. Stone fractured open along shorelines and outcrops. Layers hidden since the late Cretaceous emerged once more beneath open sky. By the time human beings walked those rocks, the fossils had already traveled upward through nearly the entire remaining history of the dinosaurs, through the rise of mammals, through ice ages, forests, and changing coastlines. They had crossed extinction events, continental rearrangements, and tens of millions of years of erosion simply to arrive within reach of human hands. The amateur collectors who first noticed the unusual jaws on Vancouver Island were standing upon the exposed edge of an ancient ocean floor. Beneath their feet lay sediments deposited in deep marine water during an age when giant marine reptiles crossed warm northern seas, and immense cephalopods hunted through dim water columns far offshore. The fossils themselves had never moved intentionally toward discovery. Stone rose around them, mountains carried them upward, erosion uncovered them slowly. Geological time transported them across 86 million years, with the same patient inevitability that raises coastlines and lowers oceans. Eventually, after an almost incomprehensible passage of time, the surface arrived where the fossils had been waiting all along. Across approximately 14 million years of existence, Nanaimoteuthis haggarti moved through enormous stretches of the Late Cretaceous North Pacific. Countless individuals lived and hunted beneath those warm seas. Generations emerged, reproduced, vanished, and were replaced again in cycles repeated over spans of time longer than human civilization itself. Entire populations drifted through deep water while continents shifted slowly overhead. And from all of that time, all of that ocean, and all of those lives, only 27 fossilized jaw fragments are known. The scale of absence surrounding ancient marine life is difficult to hold clearly in the mind. Oceans cover most of the planet, yet they preserve remarkably little of what once lived within them, especially creatures built from soft tissue. A shell may survive, a tooth may survive, bone sometimes survives, but muscle, skin, neural tissue, eyes, organs, and delicate anatomy dissolve back into water with extraordinary speed. What remains afterward is usually nothing. The fossil record often appears orderly when displayed in museum drawers or illustrated across geological timelines. Species seem to arrive one after another in clean succession, each represented by labeled specimens and reconstructed skeletons. But beneath that appearance lies an overwhelming incompleteness. Paleontology does not recover the ancient world in full. It recovers fragments produced through improbable chains of survival. For a marine animal to become fossilized at all, countless conditions must align. The organism must die in a place where burial happens rapidly enough to protect remains from scavengers and bacterial decay. Sediment, chemistry, must allow preservation rather than dissolution. Geological pressure must not destroy the fossil afterward. The surrounding rock must survive tectonic recycling, erosion, metamorphism, and subduction across millions of years. Then, after all of that, the fossil still has to become exposed near the surface, where someone might eventually notice it. Most organisms fail somewhere along that chain. Soft-bodied marine life fares worst of all. Jellyfish vanish almost completely. Worms disappear. Countless ancient cephalopods, without durable shells, passed through Earth's oceans without leaving recognizable traces behind. Entire ecosystems likely existed that remain almost invisible, simply because their bodies were poorly suited for fossilization. In that sense, the history of ocean life preserved in stone is not truly a record. It is a surviving residue shaped by chemistry, sediment, luck, and geological circumstance. Nanaimoteuthis haggarti entered human knowledge only because a few unusually durable structures endured, where nearly everything else vanished. Chitin resisted decay longer than muscle and skin. Low oxygen conditions in the Nanaimo Basin slowed decomposition further. Fine sediment sealed the jaws before currents or scavengers could destroy them. The rocks containing those fossils then survived tens of millions of years of tectonic upheaval without being melted, shattered, or dragged back beneath the crust. Even that was not enough on its own. The fossils still needed to be found. Amateur collectors walking the outcrops of Vancouver Island noticed unusual forms within the stone and chose to preserve them rather than overlook them. Museum collections stored the specimens safely for years. Researchers returned later with improved methods and different assumptions. A digital fossil mining system examined rock interiors invisible to the naked eye. An artificial intelligence model recognized subtle structures hidden inside the matrix and flagged them for study. Remove any part of that sequence, and the animal disappears again into silence. Without durable chitin, no trace survives. Without anoxic sediment, the jaws decay. Without tectonic uplift, the rocks remain buried indefinitely. Without collectors, museums, researchers, imaging systems, or machine learning analysis, the fossils stay unnoticed within stone. The creature itself would not change. It still would have lived through the late Cretaceous ocean exactly as before. It still would have hunted, reproduced, and vanished across 14 million years of deep time. But human beings would never know it existed. That is the ocean's great amnesia. Most life passes through it without leaving memory behind. The ocean Nanaimoteuthis haggarti inhabited no longer exists in the form it once held. The late Cretaceous North Pacific has been dismantled gradually by tectonic motion across tens of millions of years. Seafloor spread outward and disappeared again beneath continental margins. Ocean basins shifted position, coastlines migrated. Entire sections of ancient crust descended back into the mantle through subduction zones, where rocks softened, melted, and vanished into Earth's interior. The water remains, but the geography beneath it has changed almost completely. And still, the modern ocean covers most of the planet. 71% of Earth's surface lies beneath salt water. The deepest trenches descend to approximately 11 kilometers below sea level, far deeper than any mountain rises into the atmosphere. Across the globe, the average ocean depth reaches roughly 3.7 kilometers, an immense volume of cold darkness extending far beyond ordinary human experience. Much of that world remains only partially known. High-resolution mapping of the seafloor covers less than a quarter of the global ocean by most current estimates. Vast regions of abyssal plain, trench systems, fracture zones, submarine mountains, and deep sediment basins remain poorly imaged or entirely unexplored. In many places, humanity possesses more detailed maps of nearby planets and moons than of the terrain hidden beneath Earth's oceans. Within those depths, life continues quietly beyond routine observation. The hadal trenches, abyssal plains, and oxygen minimum layers contain ecosystems shaped by pressure, darkness, chemistry, and isolation. Strange fishes drift through black water beneath crushing pressure. Soft-bodied invertebrates move slowly across sediment plains where sunlight has never reached. Microbial communities survive around chemical seeps rising from the crust. Entire evolutionary lineages may persist in habitats visited only once or twice by remotely operated vehicles, descending briefly into the deep. Even now, new species emerge from those expeditions regularly. Modern serrate octopuses belong to that hidden world, the descendants of the lineage that once produced Nanaimoteuthis haggarti now inhabit some of the deepest accessible waters on the planet. Certain species have been documented only through fleeting camera footage captured during isolated deep-sea surveys. A remotely operated vehicle passes through darkness for a few minutes, lights sweeping across suspended particles, and somewhere within that narrow cone of visibility, a living octopus appears briefly before fading back into black water. For many of those animals, that moment remains the only observation humanity possesses. The ocean guards both its living communities and its ancient history with the same immense indifference. Pressure limits exploration, darkness conceals movement. Depth slows discovery to a patient crawl, measured in decades of expensive expeditions and scattered observations. Sediments accumulate silently across the seafloor, while currents erase traces almost as quickly as they form. Even fossilization obeys no generous logic there. The ocean preserves selectively and incompletely. It favors hard structures over soft tissue, quiet basins over turbulent shallows, rapid burial over exposed decay. Countless organisms vanish without leaving recognizable traces behind. Entire ecosystems may disappear from geological history almost completely, represented only by scattered fragments that survive through improbable combinations of chemistry, burial, tectonic stability, and chance discovery. Against that scale of loss, the survival of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti appears almost improbable enough to feel accidental. A few chitinous jaws endured burial. A particular seafloor remained anoxic long enough for preservation. Sedimentary rock survived uplift and erosion. Human beings eventually noticed unusual forms inside stone. Researchers looked again with newer tools and uncovered evidence hidden within rock for tens of millions of years. The creature emerged not because the ocean preserves faithfully, but because on rare occasions something escapes erasure. That remains true today. Beneath modern waves, beyond mapped coastlines and research corridors, the overwhelming majority of the ocean still exists outside direct human knowledge. Ancient sediments continue to accumulate. Living organisms move through darkness unobserved. Evolution proceeds in cold trenches and abyssal basins where no human eye has ever looked directly. Nanaimoteuthis haggarti is not a contradiction to the ocean's secrecy. It is evidence of how complete that secrecy usually is. For one brief moment, through stone, sediment, tectonics, and time, the ocean allowed a fragment of its memory to reach the surface. Far below the surface of the Late Cretaceous North Pacific, somewhere within dark water moving slowly over deep sediment basins, a giant octopus may have developed habits. Not instinct alone, not automatic movement shaped purely by reflex, but repeated preferences expressed through behavior over the course of a lifetime. The fossilized jaws suggest it favored one side consistently when feeding, wearing down one edge more heavily than the other through years of repeated motion. That detail remains small in physical scale, a pattern of asymmetrical wear along a beak preserved in stone. Yet it opens outward into something unexpectedly large. Lateralization, the tendency for one side of a nervous system to specialize differently from the other, appears across many cognitively sophisticated animals alive today. Human language and fine motor control show strong hemispheric specialization. Birds process certain visual information preferentially on one side. Fish display consistent turning preferences and asymmetric responses to predators. Across very different evolutionary lineages, lateralization tends to emerge, where nervous systems become more behaviorally flexible and information processing grows increasingly complex. The pattern allows parallel processing. Different neural regions handle different tasks simultaneously. Behavior becomes less rigid, more adaptive, more individualized. The fossilized jaws of Nanaimoteuthis haggarti appear to preserve traces of something similar. Researchers remain cautious about drawing firm conclusions from fossils alone, where asymmetry can emerge through injury, developmental variation, or repeated physical behavior unrelated to higher cognition. The study itself acknowledged those uncertainties carefully. Still, the recurring pattern across multiple specimens makes the observation difficult to dismiss entirely. If the asymmetry does reflect behavioral lateralization, then somewhere in the deep ocean 86 million years ago, a giant cephalopod possessed a nervous system specialized enough to produce consistent preference. Modern octopuses provide the nearest living comparison, and they remain among the strangest intelligences known on Earth. Their cognition evolved entirely separate from vertebrate intelligence. The last common ancestor shared by humans and octopuses existed hundreds of millions of years ago and possessed nothing resembling advanced thought. From that distant divergence, cephalopods followed their own evolutionary path toward problem-solving, memory, exploration, and behavioral flexibility. Modern octopuses open containers, navigate mazes, recognize individual human handlers, manipulate objects, and exhibit distinct temperaments, differing from one individual to another. Some engage in repetitive play behavior with currents or floating objects. Others demonstrate observational learning and complex hunting strategies adapted to local environments. And unlike vertebrates, much of their nervous system exists outside the central brain itself. Roughly 2/3 of an octopus's neurons reside within the arms, where local neural circuits process touch, movement, and chemical information semi-independently. An octopus arm can taste surfaces directly through its suckers. It can coordinate certain movements without requiring constant, centralized control. Intelligence in cephalopods is distributed physically throughout the body in a way profoundly different from mammalian cognition. Scaled upward into an animal the size estimated for Nanaimoteuthis haggarti, that sensory network becomes difficult to imagine fully. Arms extending through dark water over enormous distances would have sampled pressure, chemistry, texture, and motion continuously across a vast surrounding volume. The animal's experience of its environment may have resembled something unlike any vertebrate mode of perception. If such an animal possessed memory, preference, learning, or behavioral individuality, then sophisticated cognition existed in the deep ocean long before mammals achieved dominance on land. That realization alters the story intelligence is often assumed to tell about life on Earth. Human beings frequently describe intelligence as though it were a singular ascent culminating within primates and eventually within ourselves. But cephalopods demonstrate another route entirely, one shaped not by bones, hands, or social mammals, but by soft bodies, distributed neurons, camouflage, predation, and deep marine environments. Nanaimoteuthis haggarti extends that possibility backward through deep time. The implications remain uncertain, incomplete, and partially unknowable. No fossil can preserve subjective experience. Stone cannot record awareness directly. Yet the traces left behind suggest that complex cognition may not be rare in evolutionary history when conditions reward it strongly enough. Consciousness, or something approaching it, may not belong to one branch of life alone. It may emerge repeatedly wherever the world creates space for perception, memory, adaptation, and choice to become useful ways of surviving within it. In the deep water of the late Cretaceous North Pacific, 86 million years ago, a giant octopus descended for the final time through a dark ocean basin that no longer exists. Its body had moved through those waters for years, perhaps decades, propelled by soft fins and surrounded by drifting sediment beneath warm seas, crowded with marine reptiles, ammonites, sharks, and fish. Then, as with every living thing that entered that world, motion stopped. The ocean began dismantling it almost immediately. Muscles softened, skin loosened. Arms that once reached outward through deep water lost their structure and dissolved back into the surrounding sea. The mantle collapsed inward, fins disappeared. The tissues carrying sensation, memory, and whatever awareness the animal possessed vanished within days or weeks beneath the pressure and chemistry of the ocean. Only the beak endured. Made from chitin resilient enough to resist decay longer than flesh, it detached slowly from the remains of the body and settled downward through cold water toward the seafloor below. Fine sediment waited there in a basin where oxygen sometimes fell low enough to slow bacterial decomposition. The beak entered the mud gently, almost weightless at the end, and disappeared beneath accumulating layers of silt and organic debris. There it remained. Above that buried fragment, Earth continued changing across spans of time so immense they become difficult to picture clearly. Roughly 20 million years later, an asteroid struck near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, ending the age of non-avian dinosaurs and destroying marine ecosystems across the planet. Mosasaurs vanished. Plesiosaurs vanished. Ammonites vanished after more than 300 million years in the oceans. The buried beak remained below all of it, motionless within stone. Mammals diversified across recovering continents. Forests spread and retreated. Mountain ranges rose. Oceans opened and closed. The Paleocene passed into the Eocene, then the Oligocene, Miocene, and Pliocene. Antarctic ice sheets formed. Ice ages advanced repeatedly across the northern hemisphere. Human ancestors emerged in Africa while the fossils still rested beneath layers of sediment, slowly hardening into rock. Entire civilizations would one day rise and disappear during spans shorter than a heartbeat compared to the time that beak spent underground. Meanwhile, tectonic forces beneath the Pacific margin continued their patient work. Ancient seabeds compressed and uplifted gradually toward the surface. Erosion stripped away overlying rock grain by grain. Rain fractured exposed stone. Roots spread into cracks. Coastal cliffs weathered under wind and seawater until portions of the old Nanaimo Basin emerged once more into open air along Vancouver Island. The fossil waded through all of it without urgency. Eventually, after 86 million years of silence, a person walking those exposed rocks noticed something unusual inside a stone. A shape, a curve, a fragment distinct enough to preserve rather than discard. The buried remains of a giant octopus entered human awareness for the first time since the late Cretaceous ocean closed above it. From there, the animal began existing again in another form, not as a living predator drifting through deep water, but as evidence, as a specimen in a museum drawer, as scans reconstructed digitally inside laboratories, as measurements recorded in journals, as discussions among paleontologists trying to understand what kind of creature could leave behind a beak so large, as an idea moving between people, separated by continents and generations. The ocean itself never explained anything directly. It preserved only fragments and silence. Yet, from that silence emerged a picture of a world almost entirely gone, a warm northern sea where giant octopuses hunted beneath marine reptiles and where intelligence may have evolved along paths utterly separate from our own. All of it carried forward through time by a single durable structure buried beneath sediment while history unfolded overhead. The ocean is not only where life began, it is also where much of life's memory remains stored, compressed into stone beneath darkness and pressure. Vast portions of that memory are still hidden below the seafloor, resting quietly within sediments older than humanity itself, waiting without movement or intention for someone, someday, to notice what the water chose not to erase.